I wore the dress. 4 words. That's all it took to send a single father racing through an Oregon thunderstorm at midnight toward a woman he barely knew, wearing a wedding gown that wasn't meant for him. This is the story of Evan Cole, the man who signed a marriage certificate to save a stranger and ended up risking everything he'd built for his daughter. If you want to know how a joke became a vow and a rescue became love, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. The coffee had gone cold 2 hours ago. Evan Cole sat at his kitchen table, the glow of his laptop casting shadows across stacks of unpaid invoices and a half-eaten sandwich he'd forgotten about. His daughter Lucy's crayon drawing was pinned to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a unicorn. Daddy fixing things scrawled in purple beneath a stick figure holding what might have been a wrench or a sword. With a 6-year-old, you never quite knew. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old pipes. Lucy had been asleep for hours, her small chest rising and falling beneath her favorite blanket covered in dancing elephants. Evan had checked on her 3 times already, a habit he couldn't break even when exhaustion pulled at his bones. Being a single father had taught him many things: how to braid hair from YouTube tutorials, how to negotiate with a kindergartner who insisted that socks were optional even in winter, how to stretch a paycheck across groceries, rent, daycare, and the endless stream of school supplies that seemed to multiply every week. But mostly, it had taught him this: you don't joke about rescue. When someone needs help, you show up. You don't calculate the cost first. You don't weigh the inconvenience. You just go. That philosophy had gotten him through the darkest year of his life, when Lucy's mother had walked out the door with nothing but a suitcase and a note that said, "I can't do this anymore." No explanation, no forwarding address, just gone. Evan had been 28 years old, holding a 2-year-old who kept asking for mama, with no idea how to be both parents at once. He'd figured it out, though. Not perfectly, not gracefully, but he'd done it. 6 years later, Lucy was thriving, happy, secure. She knew her father would always be there, would always come when she called, would always... His phone buzzed against the wooden table, loud enough to make him jump. The screen lit up with a message from a number he'd saved 3 weeks ago with just a first name, Margaret. "Come pick me up. I wore the dress." Evan stared at the words, his tired brain struggling to process them. I wore the dress. No, that wasn't possible. That had been a joke. A stupid, exhausted joke he'd made when Margaret Hale, the fiercely proud owner of the Heartwood Inn, had mentioned, in passing, over terrible diner coffee, that her stepbrother was trying to force her into a marriage with some banker from Portland who wanted her family's land. Evan had laughed, the kind of dark humor that comes from too many sleepless nights. Hell, I'd marry you before I'd let some shark take your family's inn. She'd looked at him strangely then, something flickering in her gray eyes that he hadn't understood. Careful, Evan Cole. I might hold you to that. He'd thought she was joking too. Another message appeared. Courtyard Gates. Hale Estate. Please, Then another. I can't go back inside. Evan was already moving, grabbing his keys from the hook by the door, shoving his feet into boots he didn't bother to lace. He fired off a text to Mrs. Chen next door, the retired teacher who occasionally watched Lucy when emergencies struck. Need you to listen for Lucy. Emergency. 20 minutes max. The response came immediately. Doors unlocked. Go. Evan spared one last glance at Lucy's closed bedroom door, then grabbed his jacket and ran. The rain started 5 miles outside town. Not the gentle Oregon mist that locals barely noticed, but a full assault, sheets of water that turned the windshield into a waterfall even with the wipers on full blast. Evan hunched forward, hands tight on the steering wheel of his battered pickup truck, eyes straining to follow the white lines on the road. The Hale Estate sat on the northern edge of Ridgemont, a sprawling property that had been in Margaret's family for over a century. The main house was a Victorian monstrosity of turrets and gables, the kind of place that looked impressive in photographs and cost a fortune to maintain. Behind it stood the Heartwood Inn, the historic bed and breakfast that Margaret had been fighting to save for the past year. Evan had only been out here twice, Once to give her a quote on replacing the inn's ancient heating system, and once 3 weeks ago when she'd asked him to look at the foundation settling in the east wing. Both times, he'd been struck by how alone she seemed in that massive house, surrounded by history and expectations she couldn't possibly carry by herself. He'd also been struck by Landon Hale, Margaret's stepbrother, who'd shown up during the second visit with a lawyer in tow and a smile that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. "Just here to check on the family investment," Landon had said smoothly, though every word felt like a threat. Margaret had gone pale and silent, her usual fire extinguished in her stepbrother's presence. Evan had finished his inspection quickly and left, but the image of Margaret's defeated expression had stayed with him for days. Now, as he turned onto the long gravel drive leading to the estate, his headlights caught the iron gates that marked the property entrance. And there she was. Margaret Hale stood just inside the gates, her arms wrapped around herself, dark hair plastered to her face by the rain. She was wearing a wedding dress, not the elaborate confection you'd see in magazines, but something simpler, more elegant. Ivory silk clung to her shoulders and fell in heavy folds to the ground, already mud-stained at the hem. She looked like a ghost. Evan slammed on the brakes and threw the truck into park, leaving the engine running as he jumped out. "Margaret!" She turned toward his voice, and even through the rain he could see she was shaking. Not from cold, from something deeper, something that made his chest tighten with anger at whoever had done this to her. He reached her in 4 strides, pulling off his jacket and draping it over her shoulders. "What happened? Are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to speak, her teeth chattering. Okay, we'll talk in the truck. Come on." He kept one hand on her back as he guided her to the passenger side, opening the door and helping her navigate the running board in a dress that clearly wasn't designed for climbing into pickup trucks. She gathered the wet fabric in trembling fists and pulled herself up, and Evan slammed the door shut before running around to the driver's side. Inside the cab, the heater was blasting, but Margaret still shook like a leaf in a storm. Evan reached behind the seat and grabbed an old blanket he kept for Lucy's impromptu picnics, wrapping it around Margaret's shoulders over his jacket. "Breathe," he said quietly. "Just breathe. You're safe now." She drew in a shuddering breath, then another. Slowly, the shaking subsided. "I couldn't do it," she whispered finally. "I couldn't." Evan, they were all there. The minister, Landon, Robert, everyone. And Robert, when he kissed me before the ceremony, he whispered that once we were married, I'd sign over the inn's deed as my first act of good faith in our partnership. Rage, hot and immediate, flooded through Evan's veins. He said that? That's when I knew. This was never about, he doesn't love me, he doesn't even like me. Landon promised him the land, the whole estate, and I was just the inconvenient obstacle they had to marry off to get it. Her voice cracked on the last word, and Evan had to physically restrain himself from driving back to that house and putting his fist through something, preferably Landon Hale's smug face. "So I ran," Margaret continued, staring straight ahead through the rain-blurred windshield. I grabbed my purse and I ran, out the side door, through the gardens. I could hear them calling after me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't." "Good," Evan said fiercely. "That was exactly the right thing to do." She turned to look at him then, her gray eyes swimming with unshed tears. "Was it? Because now I've humiliated myself in front of half the town. I've burned the one bridge that might have saved the inn. Landon will use this. He'll tell the trust I'm unstable, irresponsible. He'll get the court to appoint him as executor. I'll lose everything." "No, you won't." "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." Evan shifted in his seat to face her fully. "Because you're not alone in this. Not anymore." Margaret let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Evan, you barely know me. We've talked maybe a dozen times. You can't—" "I meant what I said." The words came out steadier than he felt. 3 weeks ago, when I told you I'd marry you before I'd let that bastard steal your family's legacy. I meant it." The silence that followed was broken only by the drumming of rain on the truck's roof. "You couldn't have meant it," Margaret said finally. "You have a daughter, responsibilities. You can't just marry some desperate woman to solve her problems." "I'm not marrying some desperate woman. I'm helping Margaret Hale. who works herself to exhaustion every day trying to preserve something beautiful, who never asked for any of this, who deserves better than sharks circling her inheritance. But nothing. Evan ran a hand through his wet hair. Look, I get it. This is insane. 24 hours ago, the craziest thing in my life was Lucy insisting we needed a pet dragon. But here's what I know. You called me. Out of everyone in this town, you called me. That means something. It means I'm an idiot who didn't know who else to trust, Margaret whispered. No. It means you have good instincts. Evan reached across the center console and took her cold hand in his. I'm not going to lie to you. I have no idea what I'm doing here. But I know what it's like to feel like you're drowning, and I know what it's like when someone throws you a line. Let me be that line, Margaret. At least until you get your feet back under you. She stared at their joined hands, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Why would you do this? You don't owe me anything. Maybe not, but I've got stable income, clean credit, and apparently that's what the bank needs to see before they'll refinance your loan, right? Margaret's eyes widened. How did you... You mentioned it 3 weeks ago. You thought I wasn't listening, but I was. He squeezed her hand gently. I'm always listening to people who matter. Evan? Her voice broke on his name. Here's what we're going to do, he said, shifting into the practical problem-solving mode that had gotten him through every crisis in the past 6 years. Tonight, you're coming back to my place. You can have the bedroom. I'll take the couch. Tomorrow, we'll figure out the logistics. But first, you need to get out of that dress, get warm, and get some sleep, okay? She nodded mutely. Okay, Evan said again, more to himself than to her. He put the truck in reverse and started backing down the long driveway, leaving the iron gates and the Hale estate behind in the darkness. Neither of them saw the figure watching from an upstairs window, or the way Landon Hale's expression twisted with fury as the taillights disappeared into the rain. Mrs. Chen was waiting by her open door when Evan pulled into the apartment complex parking lot. Lucy hasn't made a sound, she said immediately, taking in Margaret's bedraggled appearance with one sharp glance and asking no questions. I'll stay until you get settled. Thank you, Evan said gratefully. I'll explain everything tomorrow. No need. Just help your friend. Inside the apartment, Evan flipped on lights and immediately became hyper-aware of every toy scattered on the floor, every dish in the sink, every sign that this was the home of a busy single father who had neither time nor energy for Martha Stewart-level domesticity. Sorry about the mess, he muttered, gathering an armful of Lucy's stuffed animals from the couch. It's lived in, Margaret said softly. It's nice. Evan dumped the animals in Lucy's toy box and turned back to her. She stood in the middle of his living room in her mud-stained wedding dress and his jacket, looking more lost than any person should ever look. Bathroom's down the hall, he said gently. There's hot water and clean towels. I'll find you something to wear. It'll be too big, but at least it'll be dry. She nodded and started toward the bathroom, then paused. Evan? Yeah? Thank you. For coming. For all of this. He met her eyes and saw something there that made his chest ache. Gratitude, yes, but also a bone-deep exhaustion that matched his own. Get warm, he said. We'll talk after. While the shower ran, Evan checked on Lucy one more time, still sleeping peacefully, then dug through his dresser for his softest flannel shirt and a pair of sweatpants with a drawstring waist. He left them folded outside the bathroom door and retreated to the kitchen. Coffee. He needed coffee, and maybe something stronger, but with a 6-year-old in the next room, coffee would have to do. He was halfway through his second cup when Margaret emerged, drowning in his clothes, her dark hair damp and hanging loose around her shoulders. Without makeup, without the armor of her usual professional appearance, she looked younger, vulnerable. Better? Evan asked. Much. She hesitated at the edge of the kitchen. Would you mind if I had some of that coffee? Please, sit. He pulled out a chair for her and poured a second mug, adding cream and sugar without asking. Fair warning, it's terrible. I buy whatever's on sale. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. I don't care if it's terrible. It's warm. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, The only sound the ticking of the wall clock and the muffled hum of the refrigerator. "Tell me about the inn," Evan said finally. "Tell me what we're really dealing with." Margaret wrapped both hands around her mug, staring into the dark liquid. "My family built the Heartwood Inn in 1892. For over a century, it was the heart of Ridgemont. Every important event, every celebration, every gathering happened there. When my grandfather died, he left it to my mother. When she died, it should have come to me. But my father remarried, Landon's mother, Diane. And before my mother's estate was even settled, my father updated his will to establish a trust. The inn would be maintained as a historical property with board oversight. Landon and I were both named as co-trustees." Evan frowned. "Let me guess. That gives him power over the decisions. Worse, the trust stipulates that major financial decisions require unanimous agreement between both trustees. I can't sell, can't refinance, can't even make significant repairs without Landon's approval. And for the past year, he's blocked everything. Why? Because if I can't maintain the property, the trust defaults to a clause that allows the board to appoint a sole executor. Guess who chairs the board? Landon." "Landon," Margaret confirmed bitterly. "He's been engineering my failure from the start. He let the maintenance pile up, let the debts accumulate, waited until I was desperate. Then he graciously offered a solution, marry his friend Robert, who happens to be a senior loan officer at Pacific First Bank. Robert would refinance the debt. All I had to do was sign over operational control of the inn as proof of my commitment to responsible management, which would give Landon everything he wanted without his fingerprints on it." "Exactly." Margaret took a long sip of coffee. "And I almost did it. I almost signed my legacy away to a man who sees me as nothing more than an obstacle to a prime piece of real estate." Evan's jaw tightened. "He's not getting it. Not the inn, not the land, not anything. I promise you that." "You can't promise that, Evan. The bank is demanding a refinance by the end of the month or they'll start foreclosure proceedings. Even if I could find a lender willing to work with me, which I can't, because every bank in the region knows Landon, and they know about the trust restrictions. I need a co-signer with good credit and stable income. That was the whole point of the marriage to Robert." "Then we get you a different co-signer." Evan set his mug down with a decisive clink. "Me." "As my what? My husband?" She said the word like it was a foreign language. "Yes, as your husband." Evan pulled out his phone and started typing notes. "We get married. You apply for the refinancing with me as your spouse. The bank approves it because I've got 6 years of steady employment, 0 debt except my truck payment, and a credit score in the mid-sevens. Landon loses his leverage, and you get time to rebuild the inn's revenue without his interference." Margaret shook her head slowly. "That's marriage fraud. If anyone found out, who's going to find out? And more importantly, who's going to care?" Evan leaned forward. "Margaret, this isn't about faking a relationship for immigration or insurance fraud. This is about giving you the legal standing to save your family's property from a predator. The marriage will be real in the eyes of the law. That's all that matters." "But your daughter, Lucy, is the reason I'm doing this." The words came out sharper than he intended. "Because I want her to grow up in a world where when someone needs help, people actually help. Where good things don't get destroyed by greedy men just because they can, and because—" He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. "Because," Margaret prompted softly. "Because when Lucy's mother left, everyone in my family told me to give up. Put Lucy in daycare full-time, focus on my career, find a nice woman to help me raise my kid. Like Lucy was a problem to be solved instead of a person to be loved." He met Margaret's eyes. "You're fighting for something you love. I respect that. I want to help." Silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and risk. "This is crazy," Margaret whispered. "Completely," Evan agreed. "We barely know each other. We'll learn. What if it doesn't work? Then we'll figure something else out. But at least we'll have tried." Margaret set down her coffee mug with trembling hands. "If we do this, and I'm not saying we will, but if we did, what would you want in return?" Evan blinked. "What?" Everyone wants something, Evan. Landon wants the estate. Robert wanted the land. What do you want? He considered the question seriously, thinking of his cramped apartment, his carefully balanced budget, the way he had to plan every expense down to the dollar. Better heating in this place would be nice, he said finally, and maybe a savings account that isn't constantly hovering at zero. But honestly, I want to be able to tell Lucy that when I saw someone who needed help, I helped. That's worth more than money. You're either the best person I've ever met or the world's most elaborate con artist, Margaret said, but there was warmth in her voice now, the first real warmth he'd heard all night. I promise I'm not conning you. I'm just a guy with a decent paycheck and a belief that historic inns shouldn't be turned into luxury condos by stepbrothers who've never worked an honest day in their lives. This time, Margaret's smile reached her eyes. Okay. Okay? Okay, let's do it. Let's get married. She laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. I can't believe I'm saying this. Tomorrow I'm going to wake up and realize I've lost my mind. Tomorrow we'll both wake up and get married at the courthouse, Evan corrected. But tonight, you need sleep. Come on. He led her down the short hallway to his bedroom, the same room where Lucy had been conceived, where he'd spent countless sleepless nights after her mother left, where he'd rebuilt his life into something stable and good. Take the bed, he said, grabbing his phone charger and a spare pillow. I'll be on the couch if you need anything. Evan, I can't take your bed. Yes, you can. It's not up for debate. He paused in the doorway. Get some sleep, Margaret. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Evan? She caught his arm as he turned to leave. Why did you really come tonight? The truth. He thought about lying, about giving her some noble reason about duty or morality, but something in her eyes demanded honesty. Because nobody should ever have to stand alone wearing a wedding dress they didn't want, waiting for a rescue that might not come, he said quietly. And because for 3 weeks, every time my phone buzzed, part of me hoped it was you. He left before she could respond, closing the door gently behind him. In the living room, Evan made up the couch with sheets and a blanket. But he knew he wouldn't sleep. His mind was already racing ahead, calculating logistics, anticipating problems, planning for contingencies. Marriage. He was going to marry a woman he'd spoken to maybe 15 times. A woman whose stepbrother was clearly dangerous. A woman who needed him in ways that terrified and compelled him in equal measure. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. Whatever you're doing, be careful, but also, I'm proud of you. Evan smiled in the darkness. At least someone thought this wasn't completely insane. He pulled up his banking app and checked his balance, mentally calculating what a marriage license would cost, what new documents they'd need, how quickly they could get everything processed. His savings account, his carefully hoarded emergency fund, stared back at him. $3,247. Not much, but enough. Enough to get married. Enough to give Margaret Hale a fighting chance. Enough to show Lucy that her father was the kind of man who helped people, even when it was hard, even when it was risky, even when every logical part of his brain screamed that this was a terrible idea. Across town, in the Hale Estate's study, Landon Hale poured himself a whiskey and smiled at the rain-lashed windows. Let Margaret run. Let her humiliate herself. Tomorrow, he'd call the trust lawyer and start proceedings to have her declared an unfit trustee. By the end of the month, the inn would be his, and Margaret would be nothing but an embarrassing footnote in the Hale family history. He raised his glass to his reflection. To family, he murmured, and drank deeply, already tasting victory. Well, at 3 a.m., Evan finally dozed off on the couch. At 3:15, Lucy padded out of her room, trailing her elephant blanket. Daddy? He jerked awake instantly. Hey, baby, what's wrong? I heard voices. Is someone here? Evan sat up, making room for her on the couch. Lucy climbed into his lap, and he wrapped his arms around her small, warm body. A friend needed help tonight, he said carefully. She's sleeping in my room. Is she sad? Yes, sweetheart, she's very sad. Lucy was quiet for a moment, processing. When I'm sad, you make me hot chocolate. Did you make her hot chocolate? Evan's heart squeezed. I gave her coffee, but that's basically the same thing. Not really. Coffee's yucky. Hot chocolate is better. Lucy yawned enormously. Can I meet your friend tomorrow? Maybe. We'll see. Okay. She snuggled deeper into his chest. Daddy? I'm glad you help people. Mrs. Chen says that's what makes you a good daddy. Evan pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. Mrs. Chen is a wise woman. She's old. Old people know things. That's true. They sat together in the darkness, father and daughter, while in the bedroom down the hall, Margaret Hale slept dreamlessly for the first time in months, wrapped in blankets that smelled like laundry detergent in safety. Tomorrow, they would go to a courthouse. Tomorrow, a single father would sign papers that would change everything. Tomorrow, a desperate woman would take a leap of faith with a man she barely knew. But tonight there was just the quiet breathing of a child, the warmth of a couch, and the strange, fragile hope that sometimes the right kind of crazy was exactly what the world needed. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside Evan Cole's modest apartment, 3 people, a father, a daughter, and a woman who'd worn a wedding dress she never wanted, slept. And for now, that was enough. Lucy was the first one awake, as usual. Evan heard her before he saw her, the soft padding of bare feet on hardwood, the creak of the refrigerator door, the clink of her favorite cereal bowl. He kept his eyes closed, listening to his daughter's morning routine, savoring these last few moments before everything changed. Daddy, you're on the couch again. He opened one eye. Lucy stood beside him in her unicorn pajamas, clutching a box of Cheerios and looking concerned in the way only 6-year-olds could manage, eyebrows scrunched, head tilted slightly, as if she were a tiny doctor diagnosing a peculiar condition. Couldn't sleep in my room last night, Evan said, pushing himself upright and wincing at the protest from his back. The couch had definitely not been designed for a 6-foot-tall man. Because your friend is in there? Yeah, baby, because of that. Lucy climbed onto the couch beside him, spilling a few Cheerios in the process. Is she still sad? Probably. Sadness doesn't usually go away overnight. Like when Mama left? The question hit him square in the chest, as it always did. Lucy rarely mentioned her mother anymore, but when she did, it was always with this straightforward, matter-of-fact tone that somehow made it worse. Yeah, Evan said softly. Like when Mama left. Lucy crunched thoughtfully on her cereal. Mrs. Chen says sometimes people leave and sometimes people stay, and the staying people are the ones who matter. Mrs. Chen is right. Is your friend a staying person? Evan looked down at his daughter, at her serious brown eyes and the milk mustache forming on her upper lip, and wondered how to explain that he was about to marry someone he barely knew. I don't know yet, he said honestly, but I'm going to help her figure out how to stay. Okay. Lucy took another handful of cereal. Can I watch cartoons? Sure, but keep the volume low, all right? She nodded and scrambled off the couch, leaving a trail of Cheerios in her wake. Evan watched her settle cross-legged in front of the television, remote already in hand, and felt the familiar surge of love and terror that came with single parenthood. What was he doing? What kind of example was this setting? What would Lucy think when she was older and realized her father had married a stranger? But then he remembered Margaret's face in the rain, the desperate relief when he'd told her to get in the truck, and he knew he couldn't have done anything differently. His phone buzzed. Mrs. Chen. Brought fresh bread, on your doorstep, don't make me knock. Evan smiled despite himself and padded to the door, opening it to find a still warm loaf of banana bread wrapped in a kitchen towel. A note was pinned to the top. For breakfast. And courage. You'll need both. He brought the bread inside and was slicing it when he heard the bedroom door open. Margaret emerged looking somehow even more lost in his clothes than she had last night. Her hair was a mess. Her eyes were swollen from crying or lack of sleep or both, and she moved with the careful stiffness of someone whose entire body hurt. Their eyes met across the small living room. Morning, Evan said quietly. Morning. Her voice was hoarse. She glanced at Lucy, who was completely absorbed in a cartoon about talking dogs. Is that my daughter, Lucy? Lucy, can you pause that for a second? Lucy hit pause with the long, suffering sigh of a child whose entertainment has been interrupted, then turned around. Her eyes went wide when she saw Margaret. Hi, Lucy said. You're wearing my daddy's clothes. I am, Margaret agreed, a tiny smile flickering across her face. Mine got wet last night. Daddy said you were sad. Lucy, Evan warned gently, but Margaret shook her head. It's okay. I was sad. I am sad. But your daddy helped me, which was very kind. Lucy considered this, then nodded as if Margaret had passed some invisible test. He helps lots of people. He's good at fixing things. She gestured at the wall. He fixed Mrs. Chen's sink and Mr. Patterson's door and the broken swing at the playground. Sounds like your daddy is pretty useful to have around, Margaret said, and Evan felt heat creep up his neck. He's the best daddy, Lucy declared with absolute certainty. Then, just as quickly, she lost interest and turned back to her cartoons. Margaret moved into the kitchen, drawn by the smell of coffee that Evan had started brewing. He poured her a cup without asking and slid the banana bread across the counter. Mrs. Chen's? Margaret asked. She knows something's up. Probably the whole building knows by now. Small towns, Margaret murmured, wrapping her hands around the mug. Everyone knows everything. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the reality of what they were planning settling between them like a third presence in the room. We don't have to do this, Evan said finally. If you woke up and realized this is insane, I won't be offended. I can drive you home, help you figure out another solution. The courthouse opens at 9, right? He blinked. What? The courthouse. For marriage licenses? It opens at 9? She took a sip of coffee, meeting his eyes over the rim. I looked it up last night. Couldn't sleep, so I researched. Oregon requires a 3-day waiting period between applying for a license and getting married, unless we pay for an expedited processing fee. Then we can do it same day. Evan stared at her. You're serious. You drove through a storm to pick me up from my ruined wedding. You gave me your bed, your clothes, your coffee. You sat on that couch all night so I could feel safe. Margaret set down her mug with a soft click. Yes, Evan, I'm serious. Margaret, unless you've changed your mind, she said quickly, and he heard the fear beneath the words. If you have, I understand. This is a lot to ask. I haven't changed my mind. The words came out firm, certain. I just wanted to make sure you hadn't. She let out a breath that might have been relief or resignation or both. So what now? Now we tell Lucy. Evan glanced at his daughter, still engrossed in her cartoons, and we figure out how to explain this in a way that doesn't traumatize her for life. How do you usually explain complicated things to her? Honestly, in small words, and with the understanding that she's going to have questions I won't know how to answer. He rubbed his face. But this? I've never had to explain anything like this. Margaret was quiet for a moment, then said softly, Tell her I need help. Tell her I need a family and you're helping me have one. That's the truth, isn't it? It was the truth, just not the whole truth. Yeah, Evan said, that's exactly what we'll tell her. 30 minutes later, Lucy sat at the kitchen table between them, a half-eaten piece of banana bread in front of her, and a very serious expression on her face. So, Margaret needs to be married so the bank will let her keep her house? Lucy clarified, demonstrating the kind of comprehension that always surprised Evan. Her family's in, Evan corrected. It's a big building where people used to stay when they visited our town, like a fancy hotel. And her mean brother is trying to steal it? Stepbrother, but yes, essentially. Lucy looked at Margaret. Why is he mean? Because he wants something that doesn't belong to him, Margaret said quietly, and he doesn't care who he hurts to get it. That's not nice. Lucy took another bite of bread. So Daddy's going to marry you so you can keep your in? If that's okay with you, Margaret said. Do you love my daddy? The question hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Margaret faltered, looking helplessly at Evan. But Lucy wasn't finished. Because Daddy says you're supposed to love people when you marry them. That's what makes it real. You're right, Evan said carefully. Marriage is about love, but there are different kinds of love. There's the romantic kind, like in movies. But there's also the kind where you care about someone and want to help them, and you respect them, and you think they're good people worth knowing. That's real too. Lucy processed this with the gravity of a judge deliberating a verdict. Do you respect Margaret? I do. Do you think she's good people? I do. Then, okay. Lucy turned to Margaret. Are you going to live here now? Margaret's eyes widened. We haven't discussed, because my room is small, but you could have Daddy's room, and Daddy could stay on the couch. Or maybe we could get a bigger place, but probably not because Daddy says we're on a budget, which means we don't have lots of money, but we have enough for important things. Lucy, Evan said, fighting a smile despite the chaos of the conversation. One thing at a time, okay? I'm just trying to understand, Lucy said defensively. If you're married, you should live together. That's what married people do. She wasn't wrong. Evan and Margaret exchanged a look that communicated 1,000 unspoken concerns. They hadn't talked about living arrangements. They hadn't talked about how to make this look legitimate to the bank. They hadn't talked about any of the practical implications beyond get married, get loan approved. We'll figure it out, Evan said, more to Margaret than to Lucy. First things first, courthouse at 9. Lucy, you're going to Mrs. Chen's for a few hours. Can I come? I've never seen people get married before. It's not going to be exciting, baby. Just paperwork and signatures. But it's important, Lucy insisted. You said marriage is important. Evan looked at Margaret, silently asking the question. She smiled, a real smile this time, small but genuine. I think Lucy should come, if she wants to. Really? Lucy bounced in her seat. Really? Every wedding should have at least one witness who thinks it's special. Lucy beamed, and just like that, the decision was made. At 8:45, they piled into Evan's truck. Lucy in her booster seat in the back, Margaret in the passenger seat wearing a pair of Evan's jeans rolled up at the ankles and a sweater she'd borrowed from Mrs. Chen, who'd shown up with an entire bag of clothes that would actually fit. I knew you'd need these, Mrs. Chen had said, pressing the bag into Margaret's hands. And don't you dare try to return them. Now, as they drove through downtown Ridgemont, past the coffee shop where Evan sometimes took Lucy on Saturday mornings, past the library where they'd spent countless afternoons, past all the familiar landmarks of their ordinary life, Evan felt the surreal weight of what they were about to do. Are you okay? Margaret asked quietly. Ask me after, he said. The courthouse was a brick building that had probably been impressive in 1950, but now just looked tired. They climbed the front steps, Evan holding Lucy's hand, Margaret walking slightly behind them as if she might bolt at any moment, and entered the cool, echoing lobby. Marriage licenses are on the 3rd floor, Evan said, remembering his frantic internet search at 6 that morning. They took the elevator in silence. Lucy hummed tunelessly, swinging Evan's hand. Margaret stared at the floor numbers lighting up one by one. The 3rd floor hallway smelled like floor polish and old paper. A sign with peeling letters pointed them toward the county clerk's office. Inside, a woman with gray hair and reading glasses perched on her nose looked up from her computer. Help you? Marriage license, Evan said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. The woman pulled out a form without ceremony. Both parties need to be present. ID for both. $75 for the standard license, additional $60 for same-day processing if you want to skip the waiting period. Evan pulled out his wallet, hoping his credit card wouldn't be declined. Same day, please. Eager, are we? The woman smiled, but it was kind rather than judgmental. All right, fill this out, both of you. Names, addresses, social security numbers, previous marriages, if any. They sat at a small table, shoulders nearly touching, and began filling out the form. Evan's hand was steady. Margaret's trembled slightly. Previous marriages, she murmured, reading the line. Leave it blank if there haven't been any. There haven't. She glanced at him. You? Just the one we're about to do. Lucy leaned against the table, watching them write with fascination. Are you nervous? She asked Margaret. A little, Margaret admitted. Don't be. Daddy's nice. He won't be mean to you. The clerk overheard and chuckled. Smart kid. They finished the form and brought it back to the counter. The clerk reviewed it with practiced efficiency, her eyes pausing briefly on the date of first meeting line where Evan had written 6 months ago after a hurried whispered conference with Margaret about how to make this look less suspicious. Any concerns I should know about? The clerk asked, looking between them. Coercion? Fraud? Immigration issues? No, Evan said firmly. Nothing like that. The woman studied them for a long moment, and Evan had the uncomfortable feeling she could see right through their carefully constructed story. But all she said was, "All right then, sign here, here, and here. You too, miss." They signed. "Congratulations," the clerk said, stamping the license with a decisive thunk. "You're legally cleared to marry. There's a judge on the fourth floor who does civil ceremonies. Usually needs an appointment, but it's Thursday morning. He might have time. Want me to call up?" Evan looked at Margaret. "Do we want to do this right now?" "Might as well," she said, and he couldn't tell if she was being brave or just numb. No point in dragging it out. The clerk made a phone call, spoke in low tones, then nodded. "Judge Morrison can see you in 15 minutes. Fourth floor, room 403. They took the stairs this time, climbing slowly, giving themselves time to process. "Last chance to back out," Evan said when they reached the fourth floor landing. "You keep saying that." "Because I keep meaning it. Margaret, if this feels wrong—" "Everything about this feels wrong," she interrupted. "But everything about the alternative feels worse. So let's do the wrong thing that might lead somewhere right." Room 403 was small and paneled in dark wood that made it feel like a library or a very old office. Judge Morrison turned out to be a man in his 60s with kind eyes and a slight stoop to his shoulders. "Congratulations," he said warmly. "First marriage for both of you?" "Yes, Your Honor," Evan said. "Well, I'll try to make it memorable. Do you have rings?" Evan's stomach dropped. Rings. Of course. How had he not thought about rings? But Margaret reached into the pocket of her borrowed jeans and pulled out 2 simple gold bands. "These were my grandparents," she said quietly. "I've been carrying them since last night." She'd been carrying them to her wedding to Robert. The realization made Evan's chest tighten. "They're perfect," he said. Judge Morrison smiled. "Then let's begin. Young lady," he addressed Lucy, "you must be here to witness?" "I am," Lucy said solemnly. "I'm the witness. An important job. Stand right here, then." He positioned Lucy to the side, then gestured for Evan and Margaret to face each other. "Join hands, please." Evan took Margaret's hands in his. They were cold despite the warmth of the room, and he could feel the slight tremor in her fingers. He squeezed gently, trying to communicate something, reassurance, solidarity, a promise that he wasn't going to abandon her now. "Marriage," Judge Morrison began, "is a commitment between 2 people to support each other through whatever life brings. It's not always easy. It's not always comfortable. But it's built on respect, trust, and the willingness to show up even when things are hard. Do you both understand this?" "Yes," they said in unison. "Evan Cole, do you take Margaret Hale to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward?" The words seemed to echo in the small room. Evan looked at Margaret, really looked at her, at the woman who'd called him in desperation, who'd trusted him with her truth, who was now trusting him with her future. "I do," he said clearly. "Margaret Hale, do you take Evan Cole to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward?" Margaret's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I do." "The rings?" Margaret handed Evan the larger of the 2 bands. His hands were steadier than he expected as he slid it onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if her grandmother had known somehow that this moment would come. Then Margaret took the smaller band, and Evan felt the cool metal slide onto his own finger, foreign and intimate at once. "By the power vested in me by the state of Oregon, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Judge Morrison's smile widened. "You may kiss if you'd like." Evan hesitated. They hadn't discussed this, hadn't prepared for, but Margaret rose up on her toes and pressed a soft, brief kiss to his lips. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, chaste and almost formal, but Evan felt it like an electric shock through his entire body. When she pulled back, her cheeks were flushed. "Congratulations," Judge Morrison said again, handing them the signed marriage certificate. "May you have a long and happy life together." Lucy clapped enthusiastically, breaking the spell. They walked out of the courthouse in a daze, now legally husband and wife, carrying a piece of paper that changed everything and nothing at once. In the parking lot, Lucy tugged on Evan's hand. "Are you married now?" "Yeah, baby, we're married now." "Does that mean Margaret is my mom?" The question froze both adults in place. Not exactly, Margaret said carefully, crouching down to Lucy's level. I'm married to your daddy, but I'm not trying to replace your mom. I'm me. Is that okay? Lucy thought about it, then nodded. Can I call you Margaret then? I'd like that. Okay. Crisis averted, Lucy climbed into the truck. Can we get ice cream? Weddings are supposed to have cake, but ice cream is basically the same thing. Evan looked at Margaret over the roof of the truck. What do you think, Mrs. Cole? She flinched at the name, then seemed to steel herself. I think ice cream sounds perfect. They drove to Rosie's Diner, the same place where Evan had first joked about marrying Margaret 3 weeks ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. Inside, they slid into a booth. Lucy on one side, Evan and Margaret on the other. The waitress, a woman named Beth, who'd served Evan coffee at least 100 times, did a double take when she saw them.
Well, well, she said, noting their joined hands on the table. A performance for anyone watching, though Evan was surprised by how natural it felt. What's the occasion? We just got married, Lucy announced proudly. Beth's eyes went wide. You're kidding. Not kidding, Evan said. Courthouse wedding about 20 minutes ago. Evan Cole, you dark horse? Beth laughed delightedly. Does this mean I finally get to meet the woman who tamed the town's most eligible bachelor single dad? I'm Margaret, Margaret said, extending her hand with surprising grace considering the circumstances. And I'm not sure tamed is the right word. Honey, getting any man to the altar counts as taming in my book. Beth pulled out her notepad. This calls for celebration. Coffee, milkshakes, and the biggest sundae we've got, on the house. Beth, you don't have to. Oh, hush! A courthouse wedding deserves at least one free dessert.
She bustled away, already calling the news back to the kitchen. Margaret leaned closer to Evan. Word's gonna spread fast. Like wildfire, he agreed. By tonight, everyone in Ridgemont will know. Including Landon. Especially Landon. Evan found he didn't care. Let the bastard find out his schemes had been derailed by a courthouse wedding and 2 simple gold rings. He's going to be furious. Good, Margaret said with feeling. Let him be furious. Lucy swung her legs under the table, oblivious to the undercurrents. Will you live with us now? The question they'd been avoiding. We need to talk about that, Evan said. For the bank to approve the refinancing, we need to look like a real married couple. That means living together, Margaret finished. I know. I'll move my things from the estate. You don't have much time before Landon tries to lock you out completely. Tomorrow, she decided. I'll go tomorrow with the moving truck and take everything that's mine. He can have the rest. Not alone, Evan said firmly. I'm coming with you. Evan, you have work. I'll take a personal day. You're not facing him alone, Margaret, not anymore. She looked at him with something that might have been gratitude or wonder or the beginning of trust. Thank you. The sundae arrived, a towering construction of ice cream, whipped cream, chocolate sauce, and cherries that made Lucy gasp with joy. They ate it together, passing spoons back and forth, while Beth told everyone who came into the diner about the surprise wedding, and slowly, painfully, the surreal began to feel almost normal. By the time they left, Evan's phone had 7 missed calls. 3 from his mother, 2 from his brother, 1 from his boss, and 1 from a number he didn't recognize but suspected was connected to Landon Hale. Your family knows, Margaret said, watching him scroll through the notifications. Small town, Evan repeated her words from earlier. Mom probably heard from Beth's sister before we even finished our ice cream. Are they going to be angry? Confused, mostly. I haven't dated anyone seriously since Lucy's mom. They're going to have questions. He pocketed his phone. Questions I'll answer later. Right now we need to get Lucy home for her nap, and you need to call the bank. Margaret nodded, her jaw setting with determination. Right, time to actually use this marriage for what it's meant for. They drove back to the apartment in the early afternoon sun, Lucy drowsing in her car seat, the marriage certificate tucked safely in Evan's glove compartment. Inside, while Lucy settled in for quiet time with her stuffed animals, Evan and Margaret sat at the kitchen table with Margaret's laptop and phone. Pacific First Bank, Margaret said, pulling up the number. I'll ask for Thomas in commercial lending. He's been handling my account. What are you going to tell him? That I've married and would like to discuss refinancing options with my husband as co-borrower. She took a deep breath. How hard can it be? Pretty hard, as it turned out. Thomas was polite, but skeptical. He asked questions about Evan's employment, his credit history, his assets. He wanted documentation, tax returns, pay stubs, bank statements. He wanted proof of address, proof of marriage, proof that this wasn't exactly what it was, a desperate solution to an impossible problem. I can send everything by end of business tomorrow, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the white-knuckled grip on her phone. And my husband and I can come in for an in-person meeting whenever you have availability. Friday afternoon, Thomas said, 2:00. Both of you need to be present. We'll be there. She hung up and let out a shaky breath. He thinks we're lying. Then we prove we're not, Evan said. He opened his laptop. I'll pull my financial records tonight. We'll put together a packet that's so thorough, so documented, he won't have any choice but to approve it. Evan? Margaret's voice cracked. What if this doesn't work? What if they see through us? What if... Then we figure out plan B. But we don't give up, Margaret. Not yet. She nodded, blinking back tears. They worked through the afternoon, printing documents, organizing files, building their case. Evan discovered that Margaret had meticulous records of every expense, every repair, every attempt to save the inn. She'd been fighting this battle alone for so long, the paperwork was its own testimony to her dedication. Around 5, Lucy emerged from her room, hungry and demanding dinner. Can Margaret stay for spaghetti? She asked. You make good spaghetti, Daddy. Margaret's going to stay for more than just spaghetti, Evan said, meeting Margaret's eyes. She's going to stay as long as she needs to. That night, they established a new routine. Evan cooked while Margaret helped Lucy set the table. They ate together, talking about Lucy's day at school, carefully avoiding the elephant in the room, that this cozy domestic scene was built on a foundation of legal convenience and mutual desperation. After dinner, while Evan did dishes, Margaret sat on the floor with Lucy and her collection of stuffed animals, listening with perfect seriousness as Lucy explained the complex social hierarchy of the stuffed animal kingdom. Mr. Elephant is the king, but Mrs. Bear is actually in charge because she's smarter, Lucy explained, and the bunny is the troublemaker who always gets lost. Every kingdom needs a troublemaker, Margaret said gravely. Evan watched them from the kitchen, soapy hands frozen in the water, and felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't supposed to feel real. This was supposed to be temporary, transactional, a means to an end. But watching Margaret laugh at something Lucy said, watching his daughter's face light up with the joy of having someone new to talk to, it felt terrifyingly, dangerously real. Later, after Lucy was asleep and the apartment had fallen quiet, Evan found Margaret on the couch, staring at nothing. You okay? He asked. I married you today, she said softly. I married a man I barely know to save a building. You married me to save your legacy, Evan corrected, sitting beside her. There's a difference. Is there? She looked at him, and in the dim light from the kitchen, he could see the exhaustion written in every line of her face. What kind of person does this, Evan? What kind of person uses someone like this? The kind who's out of options, the kind who's been backed into a corner by someone who should have protected her. He took her hand, the one wearing his grandmother's ring. You're not using me, Margaret. We're using each other. That was the deal. And when this is over, when the loan is approved and the inn is safe, what happens to us then? It was the question neither of them had wanted to ask. I don't know, Evan admitted, but we don't have to figure that out tonight. Tonight, we just need to survive. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and Evan felt the warm weight of her, the trust implicit in that simple gesture. Thank you, she whispered, for coming, for all of this, for not making me feel crazy. You're not crazy, he said. You're just fighting, and I respect that. They sat together in the quiet apartment, two strangers who were now legally bound, both wondering what they'd gotten themselves into, and both too afraid to voice the thought that maybe, just maybe, this terrible idea might actually work. Tomorrow, they would face Landon. Tomorrow, they would pack up Margaret's life and move it into this tiny apartment. Tomorrow they would start the impossible task of convincing the world that their marriage was real. But tonight they were just two tired people taking a leap of faith together. And somehow, that was enough. The moving truck arrived at 7 in the morning, rumbling into the apartment complex parking lot like a declaration of war. Evan had arranged it the night before, calling in a favor from a buddy who owned a small moving company. The truck was bigger than they needed, but Evan wanted to make sure they could take everything of Margaret's in one trip. No second chances. No going back. Margaret stood on the sidewalk in jeans and one of Evan's flannel shirts, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, looking younger and more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. She was staring at the truck like it might bite her. "You ready?" Evan asked, coming up beside her with 2 cups of coffee and travel mugs. "No," she said honestly, taking one of the mugs. "But I don't think I'll ever be ready, so we might as well go now." Lucy bounded out of the apartment, backpack on her shoulders, eyes bright with excitement. Mrs. Chen had agreed to watch her for the day, but Lucy had insisted on seeing them off first. "You're going to get all your things?" Lucy asked Margaret. "Everything that's mine," Margaret confirmed. "What if the mean stepbrother tries to stop you?" "Then your daddy will handle it," Margaret said, and the absolute certainty in her voice made Evan stand a little straighter. They said goodbye to Lucy, endured Mrs. Chen's knowing looks and subtle thumbs up, and climbed into Evan's truck to lead the way to the Hale estate. The moving truck followed behind them, a massive presence in Evan's rearview mirror. "I should warn you," Margaret said as they turned onto the highway. "Landon doesn't handle losing well. When we get there, he's going to try to intimidate you, probably threaten legal action, maybe even call the police claiming we're trespassing or stealing." "Let him call whoever he wants," Evan said. "You're still a legal resident of that house until you officially move out. And everything we're taking belongs to you, right?" "Technically. But Landon will argue that anything connected to the estate belongs to the trust, which means it belongs to both of us, which means I can't remove it without his consent." "What about personal items? Clothes, books, things that were yours before the trust?" "Those should be safe. But knowing Landon, he'll find a way to make even that complicated." She took a sip of coffee, her hands trembling slightly. "I haven't been back since the wedding, since I ran. Part of me keeps thinking I'll get there and find out it was all a bad dream." "It wasn't a dream," Evan said quietly. "And you're not going back alone. That's the difference now." The Hale estate looked different in daylight. Less gothic and imposing, more tired and sad. The grounds were immaculate. Landon clearly paid for landscaping, but the house itself showed signs of neglect. Peeling paint around the windows, loose shingles on the turrets, the kind of slow decay that came from deferred maintenance and insufficient funds. Behind the main house, the Heartwood Inn rose like a monument to better days. 3 stories of classic craftsman architecture, with wide porches and tall windows that must have been stunning when they were properly maintained. Now several of the shutters hung crooked, and Evan could see water damage on the eaves. "It was beautiful once," Margaret said softly, following his gaze. "When my mother ran it, people came from all over the state. We hosted weddings, anniversary parties, business retreats. It was the heart of Ridgemont." "It will be again," Evan promised. They pulled up to the front entrance just as the door opened and Landon Hale stepped out. He looked exactly like what he was. Old money going sour. Expensive clothes that fit too perfectly. Hair styled within an inch of its life. A smile that was all teeth and no warmth. He was maybe 40, handsome in a way that probably impressed certain people, and he moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. "Margaret," he said pleasantly, as if she hadn't run from her own wedding 3 days ago. "What a surprise. I wasn't expecting you back so soon." "I'm here for my things, Landon." Margaret's voice was steady, but Evan could see her hands clenching into fists at her sides. Landon's eyes slid to Evan, assessment and dismissal happening in the same glance. "And you are?" "Evan Cole," Evan said, extending his hand in a challenge disguised as courtesy. Landon looked at the offered hand like it might be diseased, but he shook it anyway. His grip was designed to dominate, to prove something. Evan squeezed back just hard enough to make his point. "Ah, yes, the handyman," Landon said,
releasing Evan's hand and wiping his palm on his slacks in an obviously deliberate gesture.
Margaret mentioned you'd done some work on the inn's heating system. I assume you're here in a professional capacity? Actually, I'm here as her husband, Evan said flatly. The smile froze on Landon's face. Excuse me? Margaret lifted her left hand, showing the gold band. We got married Thursday at the courthouse. For a moment, Landon just stared. Then he laughed, a sharp barking sound with no humor in it. You're joking. Not joking, Evan said. We're married. Which means Margaret has every right to retrieve her personal belongings from this house, and I'm here to help her do exactly that. Landon's expression shifted from disbelief to calculation to cold fury in the space of 3 seconds. This is fraud. You married my sister to circumvent the trust requirements to— I married Margaret because I wanted to, Evan interrupted. What happens with the inn or the trust or anything else is between her and the bank. I'm just here to move boxes. You expect me to believe that you, a nobody handyman with a daughter and a pickup truck, swept my sister off her feet in the 3 days since she humiliated herself running from a legitimate wedding? Landon's voice dripped with contempt. Please, this is obviously a scheme, and when I prove it, your little marriage will be annulled so fast. Prove whatever you want, Margaret said, stepping forward. Her fear had transformed into something harder, sharper. But while you're wasting time on conspiracy theories, I'm taking my clothes, my books, my mother's jewelry, and anything else that belonged to me before this trust existed. You have no legal right to stop me. Everything in this house is estate property. The trust governs the inn and the land, Landon, not my personal possessions. If you want to argue otherwise, call your lawyer, but we both know they'll tell you the same thing. She moved toward the front door. Now get out of my way. Landon blocked her path, and Evan moved without thinking, inserting himself between them. Step aside, Evan said quietly. The tone was conversational, but there was steel underneath. Landon looked up at him. Evan had 3 inches and probably 30 pounds on the man, and something flickered in his eyes. Not quite fear, but the recognition that this situation could escalate in ways he couldn't control. This isn't over, Landon said, stepping back. Probably not, Evan agreed, but it's over for today. They walked past him into the house, and Evan heard the moving truck pulling up behind them. Inside the Hale estate was exactly what Evan expected. High ceilings, ornate molding, furniture that probably cost more than Evan made in a year. It was impressive in the way museums were impressive. Beautiful, but untouchable. Meant to be admired rather than lived in. Margaret led him up the grand staircase to the 2nd floor, down a hallway lined with family portraits, to a bedroom that was clearly hers. It was the only room he'd seen that felt like an actual person lived in it. Books overflowing from shelves, a desk covered in papers and sketches. Photographs pinned to a corkboard. Margaret with an older woman who had to be her mother. Margaret as a child standing in front of the inn. Margaret laughing with friends Evan didn't recognize. This is everything I care about, she said, gesturing around the room. The rest of the house can burn for all I care. Then we take it all, Evan said. Every book, every photo, every piece of clothing, we don't leave anything for him to hold over you. They worked methodically. Evan brought up boxes from the truck while Margaret packed, making quick decisions about what mattered and what didn't. Clothes went into suitcases, books into boxes. The photographs came down from the corkboard with careful precision, each one a piece of history Margaret was reclaiming. The moving crew helped haul the heavier furniture, a desk that had belonged to Margaret's mother, a bookshelf that had been in the family for generations, a rocking chair that Margaret couldn't explain wanting, except to say it had always been hers. Landon watched from the hallway, making no move to help or hinder, just observing with that calculating expression that made Evan's skin crawl. You know this won't work, Landon said when Evan passed him carrying a box of books. Whatever you're planning, whatever scheme you've cooked up, I will find a way to stop it. Good luck with that, Evan said, not slowing down. By noon, Margaret's room was empty. They'd filled the entire moving truck and still had to make a second trip with Evan's pickup for the smaller items. I want to see the inn, Margaret said suddenly. Before we go. I need to see it. Evan glanced at Landon, who'd followed them downstairs. You have a problem with that? It's trust property, Landon said. Margaret doesn't have unrestricted access without my approval. Then approve it, Evan said, unless you're afraid of what we might find. Landon's jaw tightened, but he pulled a key from his pocket and tossed it to Margaret. 30 minutes. Then I want you both off this property. The walk to the inn felt like a procession. Margaret led the way down a stone path that wound through overgrown gardens, past a fountain that hadn't run in years, to the inn's grand entrance. The door stuck when Margaret tried the key, swollen from moisture and neglect. Evan put his shoulder to it, and it gave way with a groan that echoed through the empty building. Inside, the Heartwood Inn was a tragedy. Beautiful bones buried under years of deferred maintenance. Hardwood floors dulled by dust, crown molding cracked and peeling. The grand lobby that must have once welcomed guests with warmth and elegance now felt like a mausoleum. But underneath the neglect, Evan could see what it had been, what it could be again. The heating system is completely shot, Margaret said, moving through the space with the familiarity of someone who'd grown up here. Plumbing is questionable. Electrical probably isn't up to code. The roof leaks in at least 6 places, and that's just what I know about. Fixable, Evan said, running his hand along a wall. All of it, expensive but fixable. With what money? Margaret's laugh was hollow. Even if the bank approves the refinancing, that just covers the existing debt. I don't have capital for renovations. I don't have... She stopped in the middle of the lobby, and Evan watched her shoulders start to shake. Hey, he said softly, crossing to her. Hey, we'll figure it out. How? She turned to him, tears streaming down her face. How do we figure this out, Evan? Even if we fool the bank, even if we get the loan, I can't run this place alone. I can't afford to hire staff. I can't afford the insurance, the utilities, the 1,000 other things that go into keeping a business like this alive. I've been lying to myself, pretending that if I could just save it from Landon, everything would be okay. But it won't be okay. It's too broken. Evan pulled her into his arms, letting her cry against his chest while he stared around the ruined lobby and did the math in his head. She was right. The inn was too far gone for quick fixes. This would take years of work, significant capital, and expertise Margaret didn't have. But maybe, it didn't have to be her doing it alone. What if we approach this differently? He said, the idea forming even as he spoke. What if instead of trying to restore the whole inn at once, we focused on making part of it functional? Get a few rooms up to code, focus on smaller events, build revenue slowly while we work on the rest. That would still take more money than I have, but less than a full restoration, and I could do most of the work myself. I'm licensed for electrical and plumbing. We just need to pay for materials and the stuff I can't handle. He pulled back to look at her. Margaret, I've been fixing things my entire life. Houses, systems, broken situations. Let me look at this place properly. Let me give you a real assessment of what it would take. She searched his face. Why would you do that? This isn't your problem. You're my wife, Evan said, and something in his chest twisted at how easily the words came. Your problems are my problems now. That's how this works, remember? This was supposed to be temporary, she whispered, just until the loan cleared. I know, but maybe temporary doesn't have to mean half-hearted. He wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. Let me help you save this place, Margaret. Really save it. Not just keep it from Landon, but actually make it something beautiful again. Before she could answer, footsteps echoed from the entrance. Landon appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 men in suits. Time's up, Landon announced, and I've decided that allowing you unsupervised access to trust property was a mistake. These are estate lawyers. They'll be documenting everything you've removed today to ensure no trust assets have been misappropriated. Everything we took belongs to Margaret personally, Evan said. So you say. But I think a judge should decide that, don't you? Landon's smile was poison. I'm filing an emergency motion to freeze all trust assets pending an investigation into your fraudulent marriage. By Monday, Margaret, you won't be able to touch a penny of estate money. You won't be able to access this building. You'll be lucky if I don't press charges for theft. Margaret went pale. You can't do that, Evan said. Watch me. Landon turned to the lawyers to document everything. I want a complete inventory of what they removed from the main house, and I want it filed with the court by end of business today. Evan felt Margaret trembling beside him and knew they were out of time. They could fight this, should fight this, but not here, not now, not with Landon holding all the cards. "Come on," he said quietly to Margaret. "Let's go." "But we'll fight him from our ground, not his. Come on." They walked out of the inn together, past Landon's triumphant expression, past the lawyers with their cameras and clipboards, back to the truck, where their future sat packed in cardboard boxes. The drive back to the apartment was silent. Margaret stared out the window, and Evan could practically hear her replaying every moment, every mistake, every missed opportunity to stop Landon before it came to this. When they pulled into the parking lot, the moving truck was already there, the driver waiting patiently. "Where do you want everything?" the driver asked. Evan looked at his tiny apartment, at the single bedroom and the couch he'd been sleeping on, and made a decision. "Living room for now," he said. "We'll sort it later." It took 2 hours to unload everything. By the time they finished, Evan's modest living room looked like a storage unit. Boxes stacked against walls, furniture crammed into corners. Margaret's entire life compressed into a space 1/10 the size of what she'd left behind. She stood in the middle of it all, looking lost. "I'll reorganize," Evan said. "Make room. We can put some of this in the bedroom, rotate out Lucy's toys, maybe rent a storage unit for the furniture until—" "I'm going to lose the inn," Margaret said flatly. "Landon's going to freeze the trust, claim fraud, and drag this out in court until the bank forecloses. I married you for nothing." "No." Evan moved boxes until he could reach her, taking her hands in his. "No, you married me because you were out of options and you trusted me to help. That hasn't changed. Landon can file whatever motions he wants, but we have a legitimate marriage license signed by a judge. We have a meeting with the bank tomorrow. We still have a chance." "Evan, listen to me. I've spent 6 years fighting battles that seemed impossible, raising a daughter alone with no support, no money, no idea what I was doing. And you know what I learned? You don't win by giving up when things get hard. You win by getting up every single day and doing the next right thing, even when you can't see how it all works out." Tears spilled down her cheeks again. "What's the next right thing?" "We go to the bank tomorrow. We show them our marriage certificate, my financials, your business plan for the inn. We make our case, and if they say yes, we use that approval to fight Landon in court. We prove the marriage is legitimate, prove you're a capable trustee, and we force him to back down. And if they say no," Evan pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head, "then we figure out plan C. But we don't quit, Margaret. Not on the inn, not on this marriage, not on each other. Okay?" She nodded against his chest. The door burst open and Lucy ran in, home from Mrs. Chen's, freezing when she saw the explosion of boxes. "Whoa," she breathed. "Did a library throw up in here?" Despite everything, Margaret laughed. That night, after Lucy was in bed and they'd made a valiant attempt to create pathways through the boxes, Evan and Margaret sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and the documents they'd prepared. "The appointment is at 2, Margaret said, reviewing their checklist for the 100th time. "We need to bring marriage certificate, photo ID for both of us, 3 years of tax returns." "Got them," Evan confirmed. "Proof of employment, pay stubs, bank statements. All printed and organized. Business plan for the inn, including projected revenue and renovation timeline. Done. I stayed up until midnight finishing it." Margaret looked up at him. "You wrote a business plan?" "I had help. Called a buddy who works in commercial real estate. He walked me through the basics." Evan slid a folder across the table. "It's not perfect, but it shows we have an actual strategy, not just desperation." She opened the folder and read through his work. Careful projections showing how focusing on boutique events could generate revenue while keeping costs manageable. Timeline for phased renovations. Marketing strategies to rebuild the inn's reputation. "This is good," she said softly. "This is really good. I told you, I'm good at fixing things." "Evan," she closed the folder. "If we pull this off, if we actually save the inn, I want you to be part of it. Not just as my husband for legal purposes, but as a real partner. You clearly understand this better than I do." "I don't know anything about running a hotel." "Neither do I, really. My mother ran it. I just watched. But maybe together we could figure it out." It was the first time either of them had talked about a future beyond survival, and the implication settled between them like a promise neither was ready to make explicitly. "Let's get through tomorrow first," Evan said, "one impossible thing at a time." They worked until past midnight, rehearsing answers to potential questions, role-playing the meeting, trying to anticipate every objection Thomas the banker might raise. Finally, exhausted, they called it a night. Evan walked Margaret to the bedroom door. Still strange, still awkward, this dance of married people who barely knew each other. "Thank you," she said, "for today, for standing up to Landon, for all of this." "That's what husbands do," Evan said, and this time the word felt less foreign. She rose on her toes and kissed his cheek, soft and brief. "Good night, Evan." "Good night, Margaret." He settled onto the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of his household. Lucy's soft breathing from her room, Margaret moving quietly in his bedroom, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional car passing outside. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother. "We need to talk, soon." Another from his brother. "Did you actually get married? Call me." And one from an unknown number. "This is Thomas Chen from Pacific First Bank, looking forward to our meeting tomorrow. Please arrive 15 minutes early for paperwork." Evan set the phone aside and closed his eyes. Tomorrow, they would walk into a bank and try to convince a skeptical loan officer that their marriage was real, that Margaret deserved a chance, that love could bloom in courthouse ceremonies and apartment living rooms filled with moving boxes. Tomorrow they would either save the Heartwood Inn or watch it slip away forever. But tonight they had done everything they could, and somehow, lying on his uncomfortable couch in his crowded apartment with his fake wife sleeping in his real bed, Evan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Pacific First Bank occupied a corner of downtown Ridgemont that tried too hard to look impressive, all glass and steel and potted plants that probably cost more than Evan's monthly rent. Margaret stood on the sidewalk staring up at the building like it was a guillotine, and Evan could see her courage wavering. "We can do this," he said, adjusting his tie. He'd borrowed it from his brother that morning, along with a suit jacket that didn't quite fit right across the shoulders. Margaret wore a navy dress she'd pulled from one of the boxes, simple and professional, her hair twisted into a knot at the base of her neck. They looked like people who had their lives together. That was something. "What if he asks how we met?" Margaret whispered. "At the inn. I was there to quote the heating repair. We started talking." "All true, technically. What if he asks when we fell in love?" Evan took her hand, lacing their fingers together. The gold band on her finger caught the afternoon light. "We tell him the truth, that I saw someone worth knowing, and I didn't want to let her face her problems alone. That's a kind of love, isn't it?" She looked up at him, something vulnerable and hopeful flickering in her gray eyes. "Is it?" Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Chen. "Lucy wants you to know she picked out your tie. Said it makes you look fancy. Good luck." Evan smiled despite his nerves and showed Margaret the message. "She has good taste," Margaret said softly. Then, squaring her shoulders like a soldier heading into battle, she added, "All right, let's go convince a banker that marrying a stranger was a sound financial decision." The bank's interior was all polished marble and hushed tones, the kind of place where even whispers echoed. A receptionist directed them to the second floor, where Thomas Chen's office overlooked Main Street. Thomas turned out to be younger than Evan expected, maybe 35, with wire-rimmed glasses and the carefully neutral expression of someone who'd heard every sob story and lie the financial world had to offer. He stood when they entered, shaking hands with professional efficiency. "Mrs. Cole, Mr. Cole," he said, gesturing to the chairs across from his desk. "Thank you for coming in." Mrs. Cole. The name still felt foreign, but Margaret didn't flinch. "Thank you for seeing us," she said, settling into the chair with practiced grace. Thomas opened a file folder that Evan suspected already contained their entire financial lives reduced to numbers and risk assessments. "So, Margaret, we've been working on your refinancing request for several months now. As I'm sure you're aware, the situation with the Heartwood Inn has been complicated by the trust structure and the lack of co-signers with sufficient assets." "I understand," Margaret said, "which is why I'm here with my husband. Evan has stable employment, excellent credit, and he's willing to co-sign the refinancing." Thomas's eyes flicked to Evan with the assessing gaze of someone calculating exactly how much risk he represented. Mr. Cole, I see here you work as an electrical engineer for Morrison Industrial? 6 years, Evan confirmed. Started as a junior engineer, promoted to senior status 2 years ago. Stable income, full benefits, retirement contributions. And you're married to Margaret as of... Thomas consulted his notes. Thursday of this week? That's correct. Quite sudden. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Evan felt Margaret tense beside him. My first marriage ended badly, Evan said, keeping his voice level. My ex-wife left when our daughter was 2. I spent years focused on being a single parent, not dating. When I met Margaret, I wasn't looking for a relationship, but sometimes the right person shows up when you least expect it. And you decided marriage was appropriate after... How long did you know each other before the wedding? 6 months, Margaret said smoothly. We met when Evan came to quote repair work on the inn's heating system. We started talking. He kept coming back even after the project fell through due to trust complications. Thomas made a note. And the wedding itself was quite private? Courthouse ceremony, Evan said. Margaret's family situation is complicated, and I have a young daughter to consider. We wanted something simple. I see. Thomas set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. I'm going to be direct with you both. This bank has already invested significant time and resources into Margaret's refinancing request. We're aware of the trust complications, the ongoing dispute with Land and Hale, and frankly, the financial instability of the Heartwood Inn as a business proposition. Margaret's hand found Evan's under the table, gripping tight. The timing of your marriage, Thomas continued, occurring just days after a previous wedding was apparently canceled, raises questions about motivation. I need to be convinced that this is a legitimate marriage and not a scheme to circumvent lending requirements. It's legitimate, Evan said firmly. We have a marriage license signed by Judge Morrison. We're living together. We're building a life together. What else would constitute legitimate? Shared financial accounts would be a start. Joint assets, evidence of cohabitation beyond simply declaring it. Thomas pulled out another form. I'm going to need bank statements showing merged finances, utility bills in both names, proof of insurance listing each other as beneficiaries, the standard documentation we require for spousal co-signers. Evan's stomach dropped. They didn't have any of that. They'd been married less than a week, but Margaret didn't hesitate. We can provide all of that. Evan and I are in the process of combining our accounts. The utility transfer is pending because we just moved my belongings from the estate. Insurance updates take time to process, but we can have documentation within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Thomas made another note. That would put us past the foreclosure deadline. Which is exactly what Landon is counting on, Margaret said, and now there was steel in her voice. He's been systematically blocking every attempt I've made to save the inn because he wants it for himself. The refused wedding, the trust complications, even the foreclosure timeline, all of it orchestrated to force me out. This marriage isn't a scheme, Mr. Chen. It's the only option left after every legitimate avenue was blocked by someone who's supposed to be my family. Thomas studied her for a long moment. I've met Landon Hale, several times actually. He's been very, communicative about his concerns regarding the trust. I'm sure he has, Margaret said bitterly, which is why I'm going to ask you something, and I need complete honesty. Thomas leaned forward. If I approve this refinancing, if I take on the risk of backing the Heartwood Inn with your husband as co-signer, what's your actual plan? Not the business plan on paper, but the real strategy. How do you intend to make this work? Evan watched Margaret take a breath, watched her gather herself, watched her become the woman who'd built a life around preserving something beautiful even when everyone told her to give up. The inn can't be what it was, she said. Not immediately. The infrastructure is too damaged. The market has changed, and I don't have the capital for a full restoration. But Evan is a licensed engineer with renovation experience. Between his skills and my knowledge of the hospitality industry, we can restore the inn in phases. Start with 4 guest rooms and the main event space. Focus on intimate weddings, small corporate retreats, weekend getaways. Build revenue while we renovate. Within 3 years, we could have half the inn operational. Within 5, the entire property. That's ambitious. It's realistic, Evan countered. I've already done a preliminary assessment. The bones are good. The location is prime. What Margaret needs is time and working capital, not a miracle. Thomas turned to his computer, typing something Evan couldn't see. The silence stretched out, punctuated only by clicking keys and the muted sounds of the bank's main floor below. Finally, Thomas turned back to them. I'm going to make you both an offer, and you're not going to like it. Evan braced himself. I can approve the refinancing, Thomas said, on the condition that the loan includes performance milestones. You'll need to show measurable progress, completed renovations, booking revenue, positive cash flow within specified timeframes. If you miss those milestones, the bank can call the loan early. How early? Margaret asked. 12 months for the first milestone, 18 for the second, 24 for the third. He slid a paper across the desk outlining the specific requirements. Miss any of them, and we can demand immediate repayment of the full loan amount. Evan scanned the document. The numbers were aggressive but not impossible. If they worked constantly, if nothing went catastrophically wrong, if they caught every break they needed to catch, they could maybe pull it off. This is designed to fail, Margaret said quietly. This is designed to protect the bank's investment, Thomas corrected. The Heartwood Inn is a risk, Mrs. Cole, a significant one. These milestones ensure that if the project isn't viable, we can minimize losses before the situation becomes completely unsalvageable. And if we agree to these terms, then I can have the paperwork ready by Monday. The foreclosure will be halted, the trust will maintain its structure with you as active trustee, and you'll have the working capital to begin renovations. Thomas folded his hands. But understand, this isn't a blank check. Every dollar will be accounted for. Every milestone will be verified. And if Landon challenges this in court, if he can prove fraud or misrepresentation, the bank will immediately call the loan and pursue legal action against both of you. The threat was clear. They were gambling with everything, the inn, their finances, potentially their freedom if Landon could make a fraud case stick. Evan looked at Margaret. She was pale but composed, her jaw set with determination. Can we have a moment to discuss? Evan asked. Thomas nodded and stepped out of the office, closing the door behind him with a soft click. The moment he was gone, Margaret turned to Evan. This is insane. The milestones are nearly impossible, and if Landon finds any way to prove we married for financial gain, he won't, Evan said, because we're not going to give him ammunition. We're going to be the most convincingly married couple in Ridgemont history. Evan, listen to me. He took both her hands. Yes, this is risky. Yes, the milestones are aggressive. But this is the shot we have. Right here, right now. We can take it and fight, or we can walk away and let Landon win. What do you want to do? She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. I want to fight. Then we fight. Thomas returned a moment later, and they gave him their answer. The paperwork took 2 hours. Signatures on what felt like 100 different pages, initials on disclosures and waivers, acknowledgments of risk and responsibility. With each signature, Evan felt the weight of their decision settling deeper into his bones. Finally, Thomas gathered the documents and stood. Welcome to Pacific First Bank, Mr. and Mrs. Cole. I'll be monitoring your progress personally. Don't make me regret this. We won't, Margaret promised. They walked out of the bank into late afternoon sunshine, and Evan felt Margaret sag against him the moment they were out of view of the windows. We did it, she whispered. We actually did it. First milestone in 12 months, Evan said, looking at the copy of their loan agreement. We need to have 4 rooms fully renovated and booked at least twice. That's not much time. No, he agreed. It's not. His phone rang. His boss. Evan answered with a sense of dread. Cole, where the hell are you? Morrison's voice was irritated but not angry. You've got a site inspection at 4. Evan checked his watch. 3:30. I can make it. Give me 20 minutes. Make it 15. And Cole? Congratulations on the wedding, I guess. Heard it from 3 different people before you bothered to tell me yourself. Sorry, sir. It was sudden. So I gathered. Just don't let it affect your work. We've got deadlines. Understood. He hung up and turned to Margaret. I have to go. Work emergency. Of course. She straightened, pulling herself together. I should get back anyway. Start figuring out where to even begin with the inn. They drove back to the apartment in Evan's truck, and for the first time since the courthouse, the silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward. Thank you, Margaret said as he pulled into the parking lot, for what you said in there, about the right person showing up when you least expect it. I meant it, Evan said, and realized with some surprise that he did. She leaned over and kissed him, not on the cheek this time, but on the lips, soft and warm and deliberate. When she pulled back, her cheeks were flushed. For luck, she said, for both of us. Then she was out of the truck and heading into the apartment building, leaving Evan sitting in his idling truck with the ghost of her kiss still tingling on his lips, and the strangest feeling that somewhere in the past week, this fake marriage had started becoming something dangerously real. He made it to the site inspection with 2 minutes to spare. That night, after Lucy was asleep and the apartment had settled into quiet, Evan found Margaret at the kitchen table surrounded by sketches and floor plans of the inn. Planning the attack, he asked, pouring himself coffee, even though it was almost 10. Trying to figure out which rooms to prioritize. The bridal suite would make sense, highest revenue potential, but it needs the most work, whereas the corner rooms on the second floor are smaller but structurally sound. She rubbed her temples. I don't know what I'm doing. Yes, you do, Evan said, sitting beside her. You're making smart strategic decisions. Here, let me see. They bent over the plans together, and Evan felt the easy collaboration that had been building between them. He pointed out structural considerations she'd missed. She explained the historical details that needed preservation. Together, they started mapping out a renovation sequence that balanced practicality with sentiment. If we do the corner rooms first, Evan said, sketching modifications on a notepad, I can handle most of the electrical and plumbing myself on weekends, save on contractor costs. Then we hire out for the specialty work, plastering, finish carpentry, that kind of thing. How many weekends are we talking? For 2 rooms? Maybe 12 if everything goes perfectly. 18 realistically. That puts us at 6 months minimum before we can even think about taking bookings, which leaves us 6 months to furnish, market, and actually book the rooms. Evan ran the numbers in his head. Tight, but doable. Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying him. You're really committing to this, aren't you? This isn't just talk. I don't do things halfway, Evan said, especially not when my name is on a loan document. That's the only reason? He met her eyes, and the question hung between them with all its implications. Why was he doing this? For the loan? For some misguided sense of heroism? Or because somewhere in the chaos of courthouse weddings and moving boxes and bank meetings, he'd started to care about this woman and her impossible dream? Ask me again in 6 months, he said finally, when we know if this is going to work. She smiled, sad and hopeful at once. Deal. They worked until past midnight, planning and scheming and building a strategy from nothing but determination and borrowed money. When Margaret finally called it a night, Evan walked her to the bedroom door again, that strange ritual of married strangers navigating shared space. Evan, she said, pausing in the doorway, when you kissed me in the truck, was that just for show? He thought about lying, about keeping the safe distance that would make the eventual separation easier, but Margaret had asked him to be honest, and honest was what she deserved. No, he said, that was real. She smiled, soft and genuine, and disappeared into the bedroom. Evan settled onto his couch, staring at ceiling that he could now map from memory, and tried to understand what was happening to him. A week ago, his life had been simple, difficult, exhausting, financially precarious, but simple. He'd had his daughter, his job, his routine. Now he had a wife, a crumbling inn, alone with impossible milestones, and feelings he absolutely did not have time or permission to be developing. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Enjoy your fraudulent marriage while it lasts. I have lawyers reviewing every document you signed, every lie you told. When I'm done, you'll wish you'd never heard the name Hale. L. Landon. Of course. Evan deleted the message without responding. Let him send lawyers. Let him file motions and make threats. Evan had fought harder battles than entitled rich men who were used to getting their way. Another text, This one from his mother. Sunday dinner, both of you. No excuses. 6 p.m. And from his brother. Mom's going nuclear. Fair warning. Evan smiled grimly. If they could survive Landon Hale and Pacific First Bank, they could survive his mother's interrogation. Probably. The weekend passed in a blur of domesticity that would have felt mundane if it hadn't been so surreal. Margaret learned Lucy's breakfast preferences. Evan made room in his closet for Margaret's clothes. They established routines: who made coffee, who handled dishes, how to navigate a bathroom with only one shower and two adults trying to get ready in the morning. Saturday afternoon, Evan took Margaret out, not for any practical reason, but because he'd realized that if they were going to convince the world their marriage was real, they needed to actually be seen together, as a couple, in public. Lucy stayed with Mrs. Chen, who'd practically pushed them out the door with instructions to act like newlyweds for heaven's sake. Evan took Margaret to Marco's, the nicest restaurant in Ridgemont, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and gossip spread faster than wildfire. They sat at a table by the window, ordered wine they couldn't afford, and played the part. "Tell me something real," Margaret said after their appetizers arrived. "Something not on any loan application or marriage certificate. Something true about Evan Cole." He considered the question, swirling wine in his glass. "I wanted to be an architect when I was young. I used to draw buildings, imagine spaces, think about how design could make people's lives better. Why didn't you?" Architecture school is expensive, engineering paid better, had better job security. When Lucy's mom got pregnant, stable income mattered more than dreams. He took a sip of wine. "I don't regret it, but sometimes I wonder what I would have designed." "You're designing now," Margaret said, "with the inn. Those renovation plans, the way you think about space and flow and function, that's architecture." "Maybe," he allowed. "What about you? What did Margaret Hale want to be before the inn became her entire life?" She was quiet for a moment, and he thought she might not answer. Then she said softly, "A teacher. Literature, specifically. I wanted to share stories with kids, help them see themselves in books." She smiled sadly. "My mother needed help with the inn when I was 22. It was supposed to be temporary, just a year or two. Then she got sick, and by the time she died, the inn was all I knew." "You could still teach." "Maybe, after we save it. After Landon is dealt with. After we prove that preservation matters more than profit." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Thank you for helping me try." The gesture was for show. Half the restaurant was watching them, but the gratitude in her eyes was real. They talked through dinner, and Evan found himself enjoying her company in ways that had nothing to do with legal arrangements or financial necessity. She was funny when she let her guard down, with a dry wit that caught him off guard. She was smart, not just book smart, but practically intelligent in ways that reminded him why she'd survived this long fighting Landon alone. After dinner, as they walked back to his truck, Evan noticed a couple watching them from across the street. The woman whispered something to her companion, and both smiled. "We're being evaluated," Margaret murmured. "Let's give them something to talk about," Evan said, and pulled her close. This kiss was different from the quick press of lips in the truck. This was deliberate, public, a statement to anyone watching that Evan Cole had married Margaret Hale because he wanted to, not because he had to. When they broke apart, Margaret's eyes were wide. "That was," she started. "For show," Evan finished, but they both knew he was lying. Sunday dinner at his mother's house was exactly the ambush Evan had anticipated. His mother, Patricia Cole, was a force of nature compressed into a 5'3" frame. She'd raised 3 sons mostly alone after Evan's father died, worked 2 jobs to keep them fed, and developed a built-in lie detector that could spot deception at 50 paces. She took one look at Evan and Margaret walking up the front path and said, "Inside, now, we're talking." Lucy ran ahead, already comfortable in her grandmother's house, leaving Evan and Margaret to face the Inquisition alone. "Mom," Evan started, "this is Margaret. Margaret, my mother Patricia, my brothers Jake and David." "Pleasantries later," Patricia said, pointing at the kitchen table. "Sit." They sat. Patricia stood across from them, arms folded, looking every inch the prosecutor she could have been. Jake and David flanked her, clearly enjoying Evan's discomfort. "Married," Patricia said. "You got married without telling your family. Without inviting us." without even a phone call beforehand. It was sudden, Evan began. I'll say it was sudden. Thursday you were single. Friday you have a wife. Want to explain that, Evan Michael Cole? The full name. He was in trouble. Margaret spoke up. Mrs. Cole, this is my fault. I was in a difficult situation and Evan offered to help. The timeline was compressed because of banking requirements and trust complications. We didn't mean to exclude family. Patricia's gaze swiveled to Margaret. Banking requirements, trust complications. That's an interesting way to describe a marriage.
Mom, Evan said, warning in his voice. But Patricia wasn't finished. I've known my son for 34 years. He doesn't do spontaneous. He plans everything, weighs every risk, considers every angle. So either you've somehow made him lose his mind in the span of a few months, or this marriage is something other than what it appears to be. The silence that followed was deafening. We love each other, Evan said, and was surprised to find he couldn't quite tell if it was a lie. Patricia studied them both, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to Margaret. Do you love my son? Margaret met her eyes without flinching. I respect him. I trust him. I believe he's the best man I've ever met.
If that's not love yet, I think it could be. The honesty of it seemed to catch Patricia off guard. She blinked, then turned back to Evan. And you? Margaret needed help, Evan said. I could provide it. But it's not just charity, Mom. She's fighting to preserve something beautiful, something worth saving. That matters to me. She matters to me. Another long silence. Then Patricia's expression softened, just slightly. Well, at least you're not lying to me. I appreciate that, even if I think you're both insane. She pulled out a chair and sat. Now, tell me everything, the real story. No more dancing around it. So they did. Evan and Margaret took turns explaining the trust, Landon's schemes, the failed wedding, the desperate courthouse ceremony. They laid it all out, every detail, while Patricia listened with the intense focus of someone calculating exactly how much trouble her son had gotten himself into. When they finished, Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Jake, David, take Lucy to the park. The adults need to talk. Evan's brothers obeyed without argument, collecting Lucy and disappearing out the front door. Patricia waited until they were gone before speaking. This Landon character, he sounds dangerous. He is, Margaret confirmed. He's already threatened legal action. He'll do everything he can to prove the marriage is fraudulent. Then you need to make sure it's not. Mom, I'm serious, Evan. If you're going to do this, do it right. Move in together for real. Combine finances. Make this marriage look so legitimate that even the best lawyers in the state can't find a crack. Patricia turned to Margaret. You clearly care about this inn, and my son clearly cares about you, even if he hasn't fully admitted it to himself yet. So stop treating this like a business arrangement and start treating it like what you're pretending it is. That's easier said than done, Margaret said quietly. Most worthwhile things are. Patricia stood and moved to the stove where something was simmering that smelled like her famous pot roast. You're both welcome here. Lucy adores you already, Margaret. That little girl is a good judge of character. If she trusts you, I'm inclined to as well. Thank you, Margaret said, and Evan could hear the emotion in her voice. Don't thank me yet. I'm going to be watching very closely to make sure my son and granddaughter don't get hurt by whatever plan you've cooked up. But for now, we eat. And you can explain to me exactly how you plan to renovate a historic inn with no money and impossible deadlines. Dinner was surprisingly pleasant after the interrogation. Patricia and Margaret bonded over recipes and stories about the inn's glory days. Jake and David teased Evan mercilessly about his sudden marriage. Lucy demonstrated the new cartwheel she'd learned. It felt like family. That night, driving home with Lucy asleep in the back seat and Margaret quiet beside him, Evan realized his mother had been right about one thing. They couldn't keep living like roommates who happened to share a marriage certificate. If this was going to work, if they were going to convince Landon, the bank, the whole town, they needed to commit to the pretense completely. Which meant stop sleeping on the couch. Which meant acting like a real married couple. Which meant risking the careful emotional distance they'd both been maintaining. We need to talk, Evan said as they pulled into the apartment complex. Margaret looked at him, and in the dim light from the parking lot, he saw understanding in her eyes. I know, she said. I've been thinking the same thing. They carried Lucy inside, tucked her into bed, and stood facing each other in the kitchen with all the unspoken implications hanging between them. My mother's right, Evan said finally. We're not going to fool anyone if we keep acting like strangers sharing space. We need to actually live like we're married. What does that mean to you? Margaret asked carefully. Shared bedroom, shared finances, making decisions together, not just about the inn, but about everything. He ran a hand through his hair. I'm not saying we have to. We can still maintain boundaries, but the distance we've been keeping, it's obvious. People will notice. Okay, Margaret said, then let's stop keeping distance. Just like that? We've already signed the papers, Evan. We've already made the commitment. Might as well honor it fully. She moved closer. Besides, your mother terrifies me. If she thinks we need to make this real, I believe her. Despite the tension, Evan laughed. She has that effect on people. They stood in the kitchen, two people who'd promised to love and cherish without meaning it, now wondering if maybe they'd accidentally told the truth. The bedroom has enough space for both of us, Margaret said, if you're comfortable with that. Are you? I think I could be. She smiled tentatively. We'll figure it out, like everything else. That night, for the first time since Margaret had called him in the rain, Evan didn't sleep on the couch. He lay beside his wife in the darkness, listening to her breathing, feeling the warmth of another person in the bed he'd slept in alone for 6 years, and wondered what exactly he'd gotten himself into. But as sleep finally claimed him, his last thought wasn't about the loan or the milestones or Landon's threats. It was about how right it felt to not be alone anymore, and how terrifying that feeling was. Morning came too early and too strange. Evan woke to find Margaret already up, standing at the bedroom window in one of his old t-shirts, staring out at the gray November sky. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and something about the domesticity of the moment made his chest tighten. You're awake, she said without turning around. Couldn't sleep much, he admitted, sitting up. You? Same. She finally looked at him, and he saw the exhaustion in her eyes. I keep thinking about the milestones. 12 months to renovate and book 4 rooms. It seemed possible in the bank, but now it's real, Evan finished. He got out of bed, moved to stand beside her. We start today. I'll go to the inn after work, start the assessment. You handle the legal side, make sure Landon can't find any loopholes to exploit. He filed the motion, Margaret said quietly. My lawyer called yesterday while you were at your mother's. Emergency hearing scheduled for Wednesday to freeze trust assets pending fraud investigation. Evan's jaw clenched. 3 days. 3 days to prove our marriage is legitimate, or everything we just accomplished with the bank becomes meaningless. She turned to face him fully. Evan, if we lose Wednesday, the refinancing approval won't matter. Landon will get control of the trust, and the first thing he'll do is call the loan. Then we don't lose Wednesday. He took her hands. What does your lawyer need? Evidence of a real marriage, joint bank account, combined addresses on official documents, witnesses who can testify we're actually living as husband and wife. Margaret's voice cracked slightly. We have 72 hours to build a paper trail that most couples take months to establish. Then we'd better get started. They moved through that Monday with military precision. Evan took a personal day from work, and together they attacked the problem systematically. First stop was the bank, where they opened a joint checking account and transferred funds from both their individual accounts. The banker who helped them was the same woman who'd served them ice cream at Rosie's Diner, and her knowing smile told Evan the gossip mill was working in their favor. Congratulations again, she said, processing the paperwork. My daughter wants to book the Heartwood Inn for her wedding next fall. Any chance you'll be taking reservations by then? Margaret's expression shifted from stressed to hopeful in an instant. Absolutely. Give me your contact information. I'll make sure she's our first official booking. One potential customer, one witness who could testify they were actively planning the inn's future together. Next was the DMV, where Margaret changed her driver's license to reflect her new name and their shared address. The process took 2 hours of sitting in uncomfortable plastic chairs, but when Margaret finally received her new license with Margaret Cole printed on it, something shifted in the air between them. It's real now, she murmured, staring at the card. It's been real, Evan said. This just makes it official. They stopped for lunch at a cafe downtown, and Evan deliberately chose a table in the center of the room where they'd be visible to everyone. He reached across the table and took Margaret's hand, and when she smiled at him, he found himself smiling back without having to fake it. "People are watching," Margaret said softly. "Good. Let them watch. Let them see that Evan Cole is completely gone over his wife." "Are you?" The question was barely a whisper. Evan looked at her, really looked at her, at this woman who'd called him in desperation and trusted him with everything, who was fighting to preserve something beautiful against impossible odds, who'd somehow become essential to his life in less than 2 weeks. "Yeah," he said, and meant it. "I think I am." Her eyes widened, and for a moment neither of them breathed. Then Evan's phone rang, shattering the moment. His boss. He answered with an apology already forming. "Cole, I need you on site tomorrow. Major electrical issue at the Patterson project. Can't wait." "I'll be there," Evan promised, his mind already calculating how to balance work obligations with everything else. When he hung up, Margaret was watching him with concern. "You can't keep taking time off. You'll lose your job." "I won't lose my job, but I do need to be smart about this." He pulled out his phone and started making notes. "I'll work during the day. Evenings and weekends we tackle the inn. It'll be tight, but it's doable." "Evan, you can't sustain that schedule for 12 months. Watch me." That afternoon, they drove to the Heartwood Inn. Evan had called ahead to Margaret's lawyer, who'd confirmed that Margaret still had legal access to the property pending Wednesday's hearing. They had a narrow window to work, and Evan intended to use every minute. The inn looked even more desolate in the gray afternoon light. Evan grabbed his toolkit from the truck and headed inside with Margaret close behind. "Show me everything," he said. "Every problem, every broken system, every space that needs work." They spent 3 hours doing a comprehensive walkthrough. Evan took notes, photographs, measurements. He tested electrical outlets, examined plumbing fixtures, checked the structural integrity of load-bearing walls. Margaret followed with her own notebook, documenting historical details that needed preservation. "This crown molding is original," she said, running her hand along the intricate woodwork in what had been the main dining room. "My great-grandfather installed it himself." "Then we preserve it," Evan said. "The renovation plan emphasizes historical accuracy. That's part of what makes this place special." They worked until the light failed, and by the time they locked up, Evan had a comprehensive list of everything that needed to happen. It was daunting, but not impossible. "We start with the 2 corner rooms on the 2nd floor," he said as they drove home. "Smallest scope, fastest turnaround. I can have the electrical rough-in done in 2 weekends if I work straight through. Plumbing will take another weekend. Then we contract out the finish work." "That's 3 weekends of you working non-stop," Margaret said. "When do you sleep? When do you spend time with Lucy?" "Lucy can come with us on Saturdays. She's good at handing me tools, and it'll teach her useful skills." Evan merged onto the highway. "And I'll sleep when the inn is saved and Landon is defeated. Not before." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't deserve you." "Yeah, you do," Evan said. "You deserve someone who shows up, who fights, who doesn't give up just because things are hard. That's all I'm doing, Margaret. I'm showing up." When they got home, Lucy was full of questions about where they'd been and what they'd been doing. Evan explained about the inn, about the renovations they were planning, and watched his daughter's eyes light up with excitement. "Can I help paint?" Lucy asked. "I'm really good at painting. Mrs. Chen says so." "Mrs. Chen lets you paint?" Evan raised an eyebrow. "She has special paper for kids, and I only got paint on the floor twice." Margaret laughed, and the sound filled the apartment with warmth. "I think we can find some painting projects that are Lucy appropriate." That night, after Lucy was asleep, Evan and Margaret sat at the kitchen table with their lawyers on speakerphone, preparing for Wednesday's hearing. Margaret's attorney, a sharp woman named Jennifer Lynn, was blunt about their chances. "Landon has money and connections. He's hired Preston and Associates, which means he's serious about this. They're going to argue that the marriage is fraudulent, that you conspired to circumvent lending requirements, and that Margaret is unfit to serve as trustee." "What's our counter?" Evan asked. "The truth. You're married. You're living together. You're actively working to restore the inn as partners. We present documentation of the joint account, the shared residence, witness testimony from people who've seen you together as a couple. Jennifer paused. But I have to be honest with you both. The timing is suspicious. A judge could easily rule that even if the marriage is technically legal, it was entered into with fraudulent intent. Then we prove the intent wasn't fraudulent, Margaret said. We prove that regardless of why we got married, we're committed to making it work. How do we prove intent? Jennifer asked. Evan looked at Margaret, and something passed between them. An understanding, a decision. We tell the truth, Evan said. All of it. We don't hide that the marriage started as a practical solution, but we show that it's become something real. Wednesday morning arrived cold and drizzling. Evan wore his best suit, the one he'd bought for job interviews 6 years ago and had worn maybe 3 times since. Margaret wore a charcoal dress that made her look both professional and vulnerable, her hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp lines of her face. They drove to the courthouse in silence, hands clasped tightly together. The hearing room was smaller than Evan expected, wood-paneled and formal, with a judge's bench that seemed to loom over everything. Landon sat at the opposing table with 2 lawyers in expensive suits, looking confident and smug. Judge Sarah Martinez entered, and everyone stood. She was maybe 60, with steel gray hair and an expression that gave nothing away. After everyone sat, she reviewed the documents in front of her with the slow deliberation of someone who'd seen every scheme and lie the legal system had to offer. Mr. Hale, she said finally, you've filed a motion to freeze trust assets and investigate allegations of fraud. Summarize your position. Landon's lead attorney, a man named Richard Preston, stood smoothly. Your Honor, this is a clear case of marriage fraud designed to circumvent the trust's lending requirements. The defendants knew that Mrs. Cole needed spousal income to qualify for refinancing. They married specifically to meet that requirement. The timeline is damning. Wedding on Thursday, bank approval on Friday. This wasn't love. This was a transaction. Mrs. Cole's attorney may respond, Judge Martinez said. Jennifer stood, and Evan was grateful for the calm authority in her voice. Your Honor, the timing of the marriage doesn't negate its legitimacy. Mr. and Mrs. Cole are legally married, living together, and building a life as partners. The fact that their marriage also helps with a legitimate business need doesn't constitute fraud. Many marriages have practical considerations alongside emotional ones. Does the trust have specific language prohibiting marriages entered into for financial purposes? The judge asked. Preston smiled. The trust requires responsible stewardship. Perpetrating fraud to access trust funds is definitively irresponsible. Alleged fraud, Jennifer corrected, which Mr. Hale has yet to prove. Judge Martinez turned to Evan and Margaret. I'd like to hear from the defendants directly. Mrs. Cole, why did you marry Mr. Cole? Margaret stood, and Evan could see her hands shaking slightly. Your Honor, I married Evan Cole because I was out of options, and he was the only person who offered to help without demanding something in return. Was it practical? Yes. Was it calculated to help save my family's inn? Absolutely. But does that make it fraud? She paused, gathering courage. I don't think so. Because somewhere between the courthouse and today, this marriage became real to me. Evan is my partner, my friend, someone I trust completely. If that's not the foundation of a real marriage, I don't know what is. Mr. Cole, the judge prompted. Evan stood, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on him. Your Honor, I'm a single father. I don't make decisions lightly, especially ones that affect my daughter. When Margaret needed help, I could have said no. Should have, probably. But I didn't because I saw someone fighting to preserve something beautiful, and I wanted to be part of that fight. He glanced at Landon. Her stepbrother has spent months trying to steal her inheritance through manipulation and legal traps. Margaret's only crime was refusing to be a victim. I'm proud to stand with her. Very touching, Preston said dryly. But the question remains, would this marriage have occurred without the financial motivation? Probably not, Evan admitted, and he heard Jennifer's sharp intake of breath. But that doesn't make it fake. My daughter's mother left when Lucy was 2. I spent 6 years building a life alone, convinced I didn't have room for a relationship.
Margaret changed that. Not because she needed my credit score, but because she showed me what it means to fight for something that matters. Judge Martinez made a note. Mr. Hale, you've made serious allegations. Present your evidence. Preston produced documents showing the timeline. The failed wedding on Tuesday, Evan and Margaret's courthouse marriage on Thursday, the bank approval on Friday. He argued that the speed demonstrated premeditation and fraud. Jennifer countered with their joint bank statements, the changed driver's license, affidavits from Mrs. Chen and the banker at Rosie's Diner who'd witnessed them as a couple. The arguments went back and forth for over an hour, technical and exhausting. Evan watched Landon's face growing progressively more frustrated as Jennifer systematically dismantled each accusation. Finally, Judge Martinez called for a recess. I need 20 minutes to review the evidence. We'll reconvene for my ruling. They waited in the hallway, and Evan paced while Margaret sat rigidly on a bench, hands clasped in her lap. We did everything we could, Jennifer said quietly. Will it be enough? Margaret asked. I honestly don't know. When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Martinez looked tired. I've reviewed all evidence and testimony, she said. This is an unusual case. The marriage timeline is certainly suspicious. However, suspicion isn't proof. Mr. Hale has failed to demonstrate that the marriage was entered into with fraudulent intent. Yes, there are financial benefits to Mrs. Cole, but financial benefits don't automatically equal fraud, especially when the couple is clearly cohabiting and building a life together. Evan felt Margaret's hand find his under the table. However, the judge continued, I'm also not convinced this is the straightforward love match the defendants claim. Therefore, I'm issuing a conditional ruling. The trust assets will not be frozen at this time. Mrs. Cole retains her position as co-trustee. But I'm ordering a 90-day review period. At the end of 90 days, this court will reconvene to assess whether the marriage remains intact and whether Mrs. Cole has demonstrated responsible stewardship of the trust. Your Honor, Preston started to object. My ruling stands, counsel. 90 days. If in that time the marriage dissolves, or if there's evidence of mismanagement, Mr. Hale can refile his motion. Until then, the status quo remains. She banged her gavel. This hearing is adjourned. They walked out of the courthouse into weak afternoon sunshine, and Evan felt like he could finally breathe. We won, Margaret whispered. We survived, Evan corrected. We've got 90 days to prove this is real. It is real, Margaret said, turning to face him on the courthouse steps. Isn't it? Evan pulled her close, right there in front of everyone, and kissed her the way he'd wanted to kiss her since that moment in the truck. Not for show, not for witnesses, just because he wanted to. When they broke apart, Margaret was smiling. Yeah, Evan said, it's real. The next 3 months passed in a blur of work and renovations and slowly building something that felt like a family. Evan spent his days at Morrison Industrial and his evenings at the Heartwood Inn, covered in sawdust and paint, bringing the corner rooms back to life. Margaret handled the business side, permits, insurance, marketing materials, booking inquiries. Lucy became a fixture at the inn on weekends, helping by holding tools and offering commentary on color choices. She declared that the smaller corner room should be painted princess purple, and was genuinely disappointed when Margaret gently explained that guests might prefer something more neutral. But it's so pretty, Lucy insisted, holding up a paint chip in lavender. It is pretty, Margaret agreed. What if we paint your room at home that color instead? Lucy's eyes went wide. Really? Really? Evan watched them bond over paint samples and felt something settle in his chest. This was what family looked like. Not perfect, not conventional, but real. The first room was finished by mid-January, and Margaret posted photos online with the caption, "The Heartwood Inn is coming back to life. First guest room complete, more to come." The response was overwhelming. Messages from former guests who remembered the inn's heyday, inquiries about booking, a local magazine asking to do a feature story on the renovation. Look at this, Margaret said one night, showing Evan her laptop screen. The Historical Society wants to do a fundraising gala here in March. They're offering $5,000 to rent the entire first floor for one evening. Can we handle that? If we finish the second room and get the main parlor functional, yes. She was practically vibrating with excitement. Evan, this could be huge, press coverage, community support,
Proof to the judge that we're serious about this. Then we make it happen, Evan said. February was brutal. Evan worked 16-hour days, balancing his regular job with increasingly complex renovation work. Margaret handled the endless paperwork required for permits and insurance, fought with contractors over pricing, and somehow kept everything organized. They fell into bed exhausted every night, barely able to say goodnight before sleep claimed them. But they were doing it. The inn was transforming piece by piece from ruin into something beautiful again. The second room was finished 3 days before the Historical Society Gala. Evan installed the final light fixture at 2 in the morning, climbed down from the ladder, and found Margaret waiting with coffee and a smile. "It's perfect," she said, looking around the restored room. "You're a miracle worker." "I'm just a guy with a toolkit and too much stubbornness to quit," Evan said, but he was pleased. The room did look good. Hardwood floors refinished to a warm glow, walls painted a soft cream, crown molding restored to its original glory. "Thank you," Margaret said quietly, "for all of this, for not giving up." "Giving up isn't in my vocabulary," Evan said, pulling her close. "Besides, I have a vested interest in this place now. Can't let my investment go to waste." She laughed against his chest, and Evan realized he loved that sound more than he'd ever loved anything. The Historical Society Gala was everything they'd hoped for and more. Over 100 guests filled the inn's first floor, dressed in formal wear, exclaiming over the restoration work. The local newspaper sent a photographer. The mayor gave a speech about historical preservation. Landon showed up uninvited, clearly hoping to find evidence of failure. Instead, he found a successful event, a crowd praising the inn's renaissance, and his stepsister glowing with confidence as she stood beside her husband. "Quite the party," Landon said, approaching them near the restored fireplace. "Enjoy it while it lasts." "It's going to last," Margaret said coolly. "We've already booked 6 weekends this spring, 2 weddings, 3 corporate retreats, and a family reunion. The inn is viable again, Landon. You lost." "I don't lose," Landon said. "I just wait for people to destroy themselves." "Then you'll be waiting a long time," Evan said, putting his arm around Margaret. "We're not going anywhere." Landon's expression twisted with something ugly, and for a moment Evan thought he might actually cause a scene. But then the mayor called for everyone's attention, and Landon melted back into the crowd. The gala ended after midnight. Evan and Margaret said goodbye to the last guests, locked up the inn, and stood together in the quiet lobby surrounded by the evidence of their impossible success. "We did it," Margaret said, leaning against him. "First milestone achieved," Evan agreed. 2 rooms renovated and operational, successfully hosting events. The bank will be pleased. The judge will be pleased. Margaret looked up at him. 90 days is almost up. The review hearing is next week. Are you worried? No, she said, and sounded surprised. For the first time since this all started, I'm not worried. We've proven ourselves, Evan. The marriage is real. The inn is thriving. Landon has no ammunition left. She was right. The review hearing the following Wednesday was almost anticlimactic. Judge Martinez reviewed their documentation, bank statements showing merged finances, photos of the successful gala, booking confirmations proving the inn's viability, testimony from Jennifer about their cohabitation. I'm satisfied that the marriage is legitimate and that Mrs. Cole is providing responsible stewardship of the trust, the judge ruled. Mr. Hale's motion is denied with prejudice. He may not refile without substantial new evidence. Landon's lawyer tried to object, but the judge shut him down with a single look. They walked out of the courthouse for the second time, but this time there was no uncertainty. This time they'd won completely. It's over, Margaret said, almost disbelieving. It's actually over. The trust battle is over, Evan corrected. We still have 11 months of loan milestones to hit. We'll hit them, Margaret said with absolute certainty. We can do anything together. That night, after Lucy was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Evan found Margaret on the small balcony, staring up at the stars. You okay? He asked, joining her. I'm thinking about the future, she said. We saved the inn. We beat Landon. We proved the marriage is real. But Evan, where does that leave us? The whole point was to save the inn. Now that it's saved, what happens to us? It was the question they'd both been avoiding for months. I don't know, Evan admitted.
What do you want to happen? Margaret turned to face him, and in the dim light from the apartment, her eyes were luminous. I want this to be real. Not for the judge, not for the bank, but for us. I want to wake up next to you every morning and know it's because we choose each other, not because we're trapped by legal obligations. Margaret, I love you, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I didn't mean to. I fought against it because it seemed impossible and inconvenient and completely illogical. But I love you, Evan Cole. I love how you show up. I love how you fight. I love how you're the best father I've ever seen. I love that you rebuilt my inn with your own hands because you believed it was worth saving. I love you, and I need to know if there's any chance you could love me back. Evan stared at her, this woman who'd called him in the rain and changed his entire life, and realized he'd known the answer for weeks but had been too afraid to say it. I already do, he said. I think I have since the moment you trusted me enough to get in my truck wearing a wedding dress you never wanted. I love you, Margaret. Not the idea of you, not the legal convenience of you, but you. The real, complicated, stubborn, brilliant you. She kissed him, and this time there was no audience, no purpose beyond wanting to. When they broke apart, they were both smiling through tears. So what now? Margaret asked. Now we live, Evan said. We raise Lucy. We restore the inn. We build a life together that's ours by choice, not by circumstance. That sounds perfect. 6 months later, the Heartwood Inn officially reopened with a ceremony attended by most of Ridgemont. The first floor was fully restored, all 4 guest rooms were operational and booked solid through the fall, and Margaret had hired 2 part-time staff members to help manage the influx. The bank's second milestone had been hit with room to spare. Lucy, now 7, gave a speech she'd written herself about how her daddy and Margaret had saved the old building and made it beautiful again. The crowd applauded, and Evan felt his heart might burst with pride. After the ceremony, as guests toured the renovated spaces and marveled at the transformation, Evan found himself alone with Margaret in the library they'd spent 3 months restoring. Remember when this seemed impossible? Margaret asked, looking around at the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with volumes collected over generations. I remember you standing in a ruined lobby, crying because you thought it was too broken to save, Evan said. You told me nothing is too broken if someone's willing to fight for it. I was right. She laughed and pulled him close. You usually are. Hey, Margaret. Yeah. Will you marry me? She pulled back, confused. We're already married. I know, but we got married in a courthouse because we had to. I want to marry you again because we want to. He pulled a small box from his pocket. Not a ring, but a key. This is the master key to the Heartwood Inn. I had it engraved. Margaret took the key with trembling hands. Inscribed on the handle was a simple message. To Margaret, who taught me that rescue goes both ways. Love, Evan. We saved each other, Evan said. The inn was never just about the building. It was about proving that good things don't have to stay broken, that people who show up can make miracles happen, and that sometimes the best families are the ones we choose. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. Yes, I'll marry you again, as many times as you want. A year after that rushed courthouse ceremony, Evan and Margaret stood in the Heartwood Inn's garden with Lucy between them, surrounded by friends and family, and renewed the vows they'd made without meaning them. This time, when the officiant said, "You may kiss your bride," Evan knew exactly what it meant. This time, when Margaret slipped a ring onto his finger, it represented choice, not desperation. This time, when they signed the marriage certificate, it was a celebration, not a transaction. Lucy, serving as flower girl and self-appointed ceremony director, applauded enthusiastically. "Now you're really, really married," she declared, "forever and ever." "Forever and ever," Evan agreed, looking at his wife, his real wife, chosen and beloved and permanent. Landon didn't attend. He'd moved to Seattle 3 months earlier after the trust board formally censured him for his behavior. The Heartwood Inn was thriving, Margaret had been named sole trustee, and Landon had finally accepted that he'd lost. Patricia Cole, wiping away happy tears, hugged them both and whispered to Evan, "I knew from the start this was real. You just needed time to figure it out." "You're terrifying, Mom," Evan said affectionately. "I know. Now go dance with your wife."
They danced in the garden as the sun set over the inn, surrounded by the people who'd supported them through the impossible, and Evan realized he'd never been happier. "Thank you," Margaret said, as they swayed to music provided by a local string quartet. "For what?" "For coming when I called, for not treating me like I was crazy, for building this life with me." "Thank you for calling," Evan said, "for trusting me, for being brave enough to wear that dress and ask for help. Best terrible decision I ever made," Margaret said with a smile. "Second best," Evan corrected, pulling her closer. "The best was deciding to make it real." Lucy ran up, tugging on Evan's jacket. "Daddy, can I dance too?" He scooped her up, settling her on his hip while still holding Margaret close, and the three of them danced together as the stars came out above the Heartwood Inn. A single father who'd learned that rescue wasn't weakness. A woman who'd fought to preserve beauty in a world that only valued profit. A daughter who'd gained a family she'd never expected. And an inn that had been saved by two people who'd married as strangers and stayed because they'd found something worth more than property or money or legal victories. They'd found each other. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. The Heartwood Inn's lights glowed warm against the gathering darkness, welcoming guests and celebrating love, a testament to what happens when someone shows up for someone else without counting the cost. Evan Cole had once joked about marrying Margaret Hale to help with her loan problem. He'd meant it as a throwaway line, the kind of thing exhausted people say to survive pressure. But standing in the garden of the inn they'd saved together, holding his wife and daughter, Evan understood the truth. He hadn't been joking. He'd been making a promise. And promises, when made by people who show up, have a way of becoming real.